Island planning strategy. For those who've not attended previously, my name is Andrew Steen and I'm one of two inspectors along with my colleague David Spencer, who have been appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the island planning strategy. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, good. Can I ask you, if you haven't done it already, to either turn off or at least turn to silent mobile phones, and the same with email software on computers. The council, just do your usual fire safety announcements, please.
Absolutely. Exits are here, hit no. Yeah, there's no planned fire alarms this morning, so if the alarm does go off, please exit through the doors and down the stairs into the inner car park, and then we'll direct you from there. So yeah, if the alarm goes, we'll shepherd you out. So,
Thank you. So just to let you know, the examination is being supported by Louise St John Howe, who's the programme officer. If you've got any questions about the examination, please do get in touch with Louise. And the website is being regularly updated, and the examination pages will host the latest documents that have been uploaded if any new ones are submitted. So just to let you know, the examination hearings are being held in public and are being live streamed and recorded. However, only those who submitted duly made representations on the proposed submission version of the plan and who have expressed their right to be heard will be able to speak or participate, which are all people with name tags around the table. I don't think there's anyone else here today anyway. So the format of the hearings is inquisitorial but reasonably informal. We'll lead the discussion based on, firstly, our assessment of the soundness issues, which we reflected in our matters, issues and questions, or MIQs, and secondly, our agendas, which you should all have. The council has a barrister, Mr. Bedford QC, representing them, but he won't be cross-examining people, so you don't need to worry about that. So we as inspectors will steer the discussion through a series of questions. Most of the questions will be directed to the council as it's their plan, and we'll seek to bring in anyone else at the relevant point. I've got to put my nameplate out, but if you've got any, if you want to say something, upend your nameplate, put it on the desk in front of you like that, and we'll know that you wish to speak, and we'll try and call you in as soon as possible. Yeah, just remember that you can only discuss points related to your representations. They're not, these hearings are not an opportunity to widen your issues of interest or make completely new points that no one's heard before. So this morning's session concerns itself with housing, land supply and delivery. We've read the representations and statements that have been made. There's no need to read out statements. The aim of the hearings is to help inform our assessment to whether the plan in respect of housing, land supply and delivery is sound, which means it is justified, effective, positively prepared and consistent with national policy. If you consider the plan is not justified or not going to be effective, you need to tell us what needs to be changed to the plan and why. So before we start, are there any initial questions on how this morning's session will work? No, okay. Perhaps we could begin by going around the table and introducing ourselves. So can I start with Mr. Bedford for the council?
Thank you, sir. My name's Michael Bedford, King's Counsel. Like prisons and ships, I went from QC to KC when His Majesty succeeded. And I'm providing legal advice and support to the council, but as you rightly said, not expecting to cross-examine anybody.
Morning, everyone. James Brewer, Planning Policy Manager, Isle of Wight Council.
Morning, everyone. Ollie Bolter, Strategic Manager for Planning and Infrastructure Delivery, Isle of Wight Council.
Thank you, that's timing. David Farrell Design Studios, Smallbrook Developments.
Morning, everyone. Lindsay Goodyear, Bell Cornwall for Smallbrook Developments.
Bob Barron from the Home Builders Federation.
And Chris Jarman, I'm a councillor on the Isle of Wight for Totland and Cornwall, but also a freshwater parish councillor and a Totland parish councillor. Thank you.
Justin Gentleman from Fordham Homes on the Isle of Wight. I've been developing homes on the island since 2002.
James Pink from Captiva Homes on the Isle of Wight, residential developer.
Ian Delaney, also Captiva Homes, Isle of Wight residential developer.
David Long, BCM Wilson Hill, Planning and Development Consultant.
Daniel James, Plan Research. It's a small local planning consultancy.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Mr. Spencer, who I think is going to lead the questions this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Steen, and welcome everybody to this morning's session. As per the introduction, this morning we're going to be looking at the matter of whether the plan would provide for a delivery of a sufficient supply and mix of homes. We'll come on this afternoon more to the issue around mix and provision of affordable housing. So this morning's session is largely going to focus on supply related matters. I think from our perspective, we're looking at the housing trajectory which is provided in the plan. It was at Appendix 4 of the submitted plan. And if people haven't yet seen it or are aware of it or may wish to have to hand, Appendix 1 to the Council's Matter 7 statement, which provides an updated trajectory, which we'll go through as part of the first question, and then we'll look at some of the components of that trajectory as part of sort of our second question on this morning's agenda. And from our role as examiners of the plan, I think it's increasingly important that we come to a conclusion that there will be a deliverable supply of housing land for at least the first 5 years from the point of plan adoption. That's probably looking at 26, 27 onwards. Possibly into year 2, just trying to think where we are and where we may be, but it'll be one of those two years, I think, reasonably. And then being assured that beyond that point, there'll then be a developable supply of land going forward, that delivery will continue after that first 5-year period. I appreciate at the moment, plan making is in a fluid situation. Council's here with its submitted island planning strategy. I think going forward with kind of various legislative and other changes, there will be a plan, obviously, but it may take different shape, form, in its precise nature to what's here now. But nonetheless, that doesn't kind of absolve us of our kind of responsibility to look carefully at the deliverability of this plan, certainly in the short term, i.e. the next sort of five years in particular. So we've looked at, as part of the examination so far, the housing requirements, so the overall numbers that the plan is seeking to deliver. And we've heard the arguments both why the council considers that to be a sound position, from those who consider it plan should actually be providing for less housing, and from those who have argued that the plan should be providing for the standard method figure of 703 dwellings per annum. So we've had that discussion. We've also looked at some of the individual site allocations that are proposed in the plan, so we're not necessarily going to reopen part of this morning's discussion the merits of those sites, but we will want to, I think, come back to how they've been profiled and when the council thinks they're going to start delivering, and sort of quantums of housing that have been being delivered. And then finally, when we get to the sort of back end of this morning's agenda, we're going to look at some wider issues around housing delivery and other policies in the plan that the council's proposing,
I think to address an issue it recognises, even when it grants planning permission, stimulating delivery on the island. So if I can turn to my first question, it was question 7.1, and it's the first item on the agenda. Obviously, the council has looked at this again, Mr. Brewer, in terms of the trajectory as has been submitted. Obviously, things don't stand still in the world of planning. Missions potentially granted, lapsed. I think the council's now got the benefit. I think it's in our examination library document ED3A, most recent monitoring data for 2023-24. So you know you had consented at 1st of April 2024. I think a number of those factors have now fed into the updated trajectory. But I wonder if you could just, for our benefit and for others in the room, just give us a brief overview of what's in the proposed appendix, Appendix 1, as opposed compared to what was provided on plan submission back at the end of October.
Thank you, sir. And yeah, good morning, everyone. Just to, I guess, set out some of the key parameters of our housing trajectory. So I think the starting point is just to kind of reflect on the three sources of supply that we set out within that. So they are large sites with permission, allocated sites, and windfall. So that first line, the large sites with permission, is all the large sites that have planning permission over 10 units. Excuse me. Some of those may be outline permissions, some of them may be full, some reserve matters, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail. The second line, the allocated sites, are those sites which we're proposing to allocate through the IPS, and when we see some of the delivery on those sites coming forward. And then finally, windfall, which is anything coming forward, sites under 10 across the island. It's a key source of supply for us and has been historically. And again, we'll come on to the kind of evidence behind that number of 100 a year later on in the agenda. So I think that's the key starting point, those three sources of supply that make up our housing trajectory. We've taken on board some of the comments from the MIQs around how to present that trajectory. So we've added in the projected supply from those large sites with permission of over 100 dwellings, and you'll see that there's 6 of them. And then again, we've done the same thing for the projected supply from the proposed allocations over 100 dwellings in the plan period. And I think as you probably see from the trajectory, from a current perspective, there is a relatively strong pipeline of permissions, and I'll come on to some of the numbers in a bit more detail soon. And the way we've tried to profile those allocations is to obviously, some of them, many of them are in the planning process already. We have a number of applications, as we discussed yesterday, potentially about to be issued, or some coming forward very soon. So again, thinking around some of the information we've had from planning statements around the ability of those sites to deliver, that's fed into some of that trajectory work. As a point of principle, this has very much been a kind of bottom-up approach to housing trajectory. So this is a kind of almost a site-by-site basis. We haven't applied any kind of, if you like, island housing market characteristics to it. We've obviously had lots of discussion, but certainly last week, and we probably will do today, around what some of those characteristics are, potentially and around the time it can take potentially for permissions to be delivered. But we haven't applied any of that to the trajectory, so it is effectively on our perspective as plan makers, with the information we've got on face value, when we think those sites will come forward based on information that we've seen, or using our judgment. So I think that's an update on where we're at with the trajectory and how we've put it together, and happy to, yeah, where we're at.
Thank you for that. I think from our perspective as inspectors, and thinking about plan soundness, I think we welcome the way the council's now sort of represented the trajectory, so it's clearer for decision makers going forward where some of the key components of supply are likely to come forward. So if anything does change, it's a bit more sort of transparent as to what that means and potentially what its significance is. I think the council clarified this yesterday, but for the benefit of the room, and again, so it just sticks in my memory. So the Medina yard site in Cowes, which was quite a sizable permission at, I think the council was anticipating about 400 from that site, is not reflected in the latest trajectory. but the nearby Thetis Road site in Cowes, following discussion with the Environment Agency, to come out, albeit it's 25. Yeah, so it's a relatively modest site.
Yeah, yes, that's entirely correct, sir. So as you'll see from the Appendix 1, the Medina Yard site doesn't feature in that projected supply from large sites permission. And obviously, as we touched on, that's around issues of A, the permission expiring, and B, changing land ownership. So the uncertainty over whether that site will come forward. And yes, the Thetis Road site, so H818 in the plan for 25 units, following discussions and statement of common ground, the Environment Agency, that site is to come out, but that is in those figures. So effectively, if you look at the 6428 on the right-hand side, the total supply, that would effectively be 6403 without that Thetis.
Thank you. And I think the council says on what it would say to us is a sound plan, sound housing requirement of 453 dwellings per annum. Even on the slightly moderately adjusted 6,403 kind of total supply, have a buffer. I think so it's about 9%. I mean, it's obviously we've got some significant issues to grapple with from last week's discussion. Just doing some rudimentary maths, if we were reflecting on and ultimately persuaded by submissions that were made last week, again reflecting written material that's before us, to extend the plan period, which I know some people were suggesting would be necessary for soundness, that's on 453 dwellings per annum. Or more fundamentally, to go with the standard method figure, which I think really, recollection of the discussion, I think that was the only sort of alternative figure that was identified by anybody. I don't think anybody's suggesting there's an interim or a figure between the two. Just looking at the council's figure and the council's trajectory, there doesn't appear to be kind of any buffer. The buffer would quickly evaporate for either of those scenarios.
So I think that
I appreciate that's not the council. You're not saying or articulating to us. I'm quite clear the council considers 453 as a sound figure, and that plan period sounds. That's the position we start from.
Yeah, no, so I wasn't going to go back into, in a sense, the discussions last week, but I did think that given that we've got a number of participants here in the room, and it bears on part of that discussion, whether it might be helpful at this stage if Mr. Brewer just briefly updated you on the draft local development scheme programme for the next plan making, because you remember that's been mentioned before, and I think when it was mentioned last week, Mr. Brewer said that the document was still emerging. I think it's probably still strictly emerging, but Mr. Brewer can probably give you a bit more coate form that, which might just help, as they given the number of people that we've got and the discussion. And that obviously bears on one of the topics, which is obviously the question of extending plan period as opposed to simply changing requirement numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Bedford. And yeah, just to update on that. So we have, just finishing off the draft of the LDS. So as people are aware, the transitional arrangements under the new NPPF will require us, given the housing department plan, to start work on a new plan straight away post-adoption. The government are obviously publishing quite a lot of information at the moment on what that new plan making process will look like. We still have, I guess, scarce detail on the particular gateways. However, time frame is pretty clear. It's going to be a 30-month process, although albeit there's a kind of 6-month prep at the start of that. So, respective of our next local plan, if we're working on the adoption of this one towards the end of this year, then we'll be looking to start that kind of 6-month kind of prep progress in around April next year, and then the 30 months would kind of kick in from November 2026, and then we'd be looking at a potential adoption in early 2029. So that's within the 30-month period. So again, I guess in that context of the discussion around the numbers we're looking at today in this plan, that's the timescales that we're working for. So I suppose the best way to then badge that back to the IPS is IPS is a stepping stone in between the current position we're in with the core strategy in 2012, potential to adopt this, and then that next plan, which is as far as we can decipher, will be early 2029.
Thank you. That. Okay, I'll not draw the council any further on buffers and what flexibility that might provide. I think that's the figures are there, and we can do the maths. I think it's probably fair to say. I mean, this is a slightly difficult issue in the extent that here we are plan making, and there are tests of soundness against the December 2023 MPPF. If the plan's found sound, it goes out into a real world. It's a slightly different real world in terms of buffers, etc. But council's obviously got the council's figures on that. Is there anything further people want to say just on the general sort of presentation of the trajectory and what's present? We'll come in. This is, you might have seen some of the lines that are in there that we've got kind of sites and how they're profiled. We'll come on to that as part of my next question, but in terms of just generally council's approach to kind of preparing a trajectory. If I hear from Mr. Gentleman first, and then Mr. Delaney from Captiva.
Thanks very much. It's really just specifically with regard to the buffer. The council's own evidence supplied in the Three Dragons report cited a 30% fallout rate, and so a 9% buffer just is insufficient. I've already raised this earlier on, so I'm not going to dive into depth on it, but the buffer is not sufficient for the fallout rate that's previously been acknowledged. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Going without sort of going back too far to our discussions last year, I mean, plan making hopefully moves on, and councils look at sites through particularly the strategic housing land availability assessment process, I think, to try and counter some of these past issues around non-implementation, providing sort of more assurance that what goes into the plan has been through the kind of the sieve of, you know, is it achievable, suitable, available, to kind of help kind of de-risk this issue. I mean, from you, whether that provides you with any kind of assurance, or is there any issue here? I mean, sites do drop out, but then they come back in. I mean, is there in your view, a significant kind of permanent kind of non-implementation issue that sites are just falling out of the system and not coming back in?
What we're looking at and what the statistics in the Three Dragons report brought up was a countrywide issue of when you're looking at granting consent, a national fallout rate from those approvals. So that's not a localised issue for us as an island. That's a national picture. If it's a national picture, we should be taking that into account with our allocations. In terms of sieving sites, the 2018 SCHLA process, which preceded the one that's part of this document, was, in my opinion, far more in depth and consulted those in the industry about viability of key sites. And in those consultations, things like the Newport Quay, which we've discussed, again, a specific allocation, but also the Medina Yard scheme were pointed out that they would never be financially viable and therefore should never have been included. But I think it's that key point that this is a national picture, and if we've got a national picture that presents something, then that isn't a local issue with something that either the council are doing or we're doing, but we should be accounting for that fallout rate and what we're providing here in terms of numbers. Thank you.
Mr. Delaney next, please.
Thank you. An observation reflected in what we'd submitted was that land allocation has been one of the greatest challenges to achieving delivery over the last 10 years on the island. to put it in context, if we look at the delivery plan from projected supply from large sites with permission, Captiva is forecast to be delivering 301 of the 326 units to be delivered over the next 3 years. So we are a significant part of the picture here. And our experience of trying to bring sites through the planning process has been mixed. We've had some real successes in terms of sites like Horsebridge Hill that have moved through the system very quickly and effectively. And we've had sites that have faced significant resistance and challenges and barriers like Westacre. Underlying those issues has been the lack of allocation of sites in the 2012 plan. And the land was not allocated through that 2012 plan. The last land allocation was 1996. And as we project forward in those tables now, we see the issues of lack of allocation of large sites undermining our ability as a company to deliver in the out years. So from the vast majority, 301 of 326 units in the first 3 years, our delivery rate tails off significantly from 29-30 onwards because there are not the large sites being allocated. And I think to the buffer point, we're not seeing enough sites being put forward that's going to enable us to maintain the delivery which we are capable of operating at.
Thank you. Mr. Long.
Just to follow on Justin's point, that the picture of fallout rate isn't a consequence of bad plan making or planning authority. You know, delivery is not just about council's delivery record. It's not their sole burden to deliver housing. But the issue of fallout rate is not about planning policy, it's about commercial issues primarily. So if you have those commercial issues that have a consequence on delivery, that's, you know, Justin correctly saying against buffer to manage against the commercial fallout rate. I don't know, an option agreement expires, utility company says we can't get there's a big problem at the moment saying we're going off gas, and so the bolstering up the network for electric is causing big capacity problems nationwide, because that's where building regulations is. So these things do happen. It's not a consequence of failure of plan, but to have that buffer is pretty important. In any business, to have buffering is important for de-risking and I suppose delivery rates to meet your objectives. Just picking on the point that Ian was saying, you know, from a Captiva perspective, you know, they've always made clear to the council that their delivery, you know, 250 to 300 houses a year, and it's taken quite a long time since conception of when Captiva ramped up to now to deliver the 300 in this very early supply. But then, you know, beyond the 29 date, there's no real vehicle for them to carry on that supply. And, you know, they are the biggest house builder on the island. I suppose it comes back to the point of common ground last week, where kind of think parties agreed that land availability isn't the problem per se against SLAR, and the interrelationship with sustainability, the settlement hierarchy, but it's about the availability of land allocations and encouraging smaller SMEs to build up, and also to get potentially some nationals over based on the steady platform. My opinion on this, the step supply on years 1 to 3 feel more balanced against the council's initial plan and trajectory in 4, for sure. I think that feels much more realistic now. But, you know, clearly some work, you know, the debate about standard methodology versus the kind of exceptional circumstance case in reduction, just not about land availability, but about take up of developers to fall off then from year 8 essentially onwards. There's something that's something for you to grapple, but you know, clearly advocating standard methodology if we roll out the sustainable carpet for a better word to achieve those goals, and to go from year 13 to 15 as a balanced supply.
Thank you. I'll come back to the council on some of these points. Before I do that, Councillor Jarman.
So on this topic, I think the concern I would have is looking simply at this as an island perspective, as a whole island issue. The demographics of the island and the geography of the island have an impact on this as well in terms of suitability and deliverable elements. And I don't have a concern, as I'm sure the developer community does themselves, about needing so substantial a buffer. And I think the reason for that is that as the year after year now, the demographics for this island continue to come out from the ONS, what they're showing is for certainly the next 7 or 8 years, is for every year an annual decline of the population of the Isle of Wight. So my concern would be sites which not only are just sites with numbers on them, but to be concerned about where those sites are and what is being delivered on those sites against the need that the island actually has. And our needs are very specific. They are, at the moment, predominantly for social rent properties of 1 and 2 bedroom levels. So having a generalized plan which talks about simple areas and numbers would seem to omit that level of detail, which is critical to this island.
Thank you. I'll pick up 2 points with the council. I think first area I want the council to come back on it is Mr. Gentleman's point around potential non-implementation or non-implementation rates, whether the council's buffer kind of factors that in, or whether the council should make further allowances within its supply kind of forecast to account for potential non-implementation. And then secondly, I think the point that's being made is around certainly by year 8, so 2031-32, on the current trajectory, kind of delivery is forecast to kind of come down, and that's the trend for the remaining part of the current plan period. I suppose the council's response, I think, Mr. Brewer, from what you're saying earlier, is to us as inspectors, I'll paraphrase, but don't worry, working on an LDS, there'll be another plan in place by that time, by 2029. But we'll look forward from that point, given concerns we're hearing from some of the, I don't know, can I describe Captiva as the principal house builder on the island by volume? The company building the most homes, I think, expressing their concerns that in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, they could be facing a kind of a supply cliff edge.
Thank you, sir. And I guess I'll start with the first point and then I'll come back to the second point. So I guess the point about non-implementation, it's a difficult one for the LPA to tackle, really, because we obviously are aware it happens. And as Mr. Long, Mr. Gentleman rightly set out, that often there are reasons beyond anyone's expectation or control at a number of stages of the planning process. And there are various reasons for that. I think, in terms of buffer, one way of addressing that issue, if it is an issue which is a challenge, it would be to increase the buffer. But I think, again, from our perspective, we look at what we've got in the system at the moment. We have we have a pretty strong pipeline of consents. And when you look at the figures kind of going back the last 4 years, and bear with me, 2021, there were 2,355 homes with planning permission, obviously a mix of full and outline. 21-22, that's 3,017. 22-23, it's 2,078. And 23-24, it's 2,645. So that is a strong supply of homes with planning permission. So from our perspective, in terms of that drop-off rate, heard the mention of 30%, and obviously some of that's double counting because it's the same, but I'm just trying to give you a picture of the numbers that we've got in terms of supply. And then we look at what's being delivered on the island in those years, 445, 490, 357, 262. There's a big gap there. So from our perspective, we feel there is a buffer there already in terms of what's permitted, but we certainly acknowledge that potentially as you get further into the plan period may become an issue. And that kind of leads on to that second point, really around the kind of don't worry, there'll be a new local plan in the LDS, which, yeah, paraphrasing, that is obviously on the horizon. But I think that's not the only issue when we're thinking about this. When you look at the trajectory and we look at those figures kind of year 3 to year 8, which look very strong on paper in terms of the 600, 667, 704, etc. The reality is that's set out by the figures I just ran through, that whilst those permissions are in place, as we've already heard, at this moment in time, site's got planning permission, we would expect it to come forward. And as we heard last week, it's a big investment from a financial perspective for a developer to make that commitment through to get a permission in the first place. So you wouldn't think they would do that unless they had every intention of implementing it. But things change. So I think even within those numbers there in the trajectory, things will change. And it may be that some of those numbers get pushed out from perhaps years 4, 5, 6 into 7, 8, 9. Again, we just don't know which sites that might be because we haven't applied that to the trajectory because we've done that bottom-up approach. So I think there are kind of mechanisms within this working that cover some of the issues that have been raised, but absolutely acknowledge that that there is always that fallout rate. But we think the buffer, the combination of the buffer we've already got in there, new plan coming forward, and the fact that we've got a strong supply in the pipeline at the moment already, we're comfortable with the position we've set out.
Thank you for that. I mean, we've kind of said at previous sessions, which should echo again, and for this session, what we're interested in from those who think that the plan is not sound, what potential modifications should be made. I think probably glean from the kind of contributions around the table, there's probably a general theme around release more sites or make more land available. I think it's probably the sum of the message from those who are concerned around what the plan is presenting in terms of housing supply and delivery. I'll bring others in. I didn't see what order nameplates went in, so I'm going to go quite simply from my right to left. So I'm going to start with Mr. Berrines, Mr. Gentleman, Mr. Pink, and then Mr. James.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of quick points. Firstly, with regard to the trajectory, welcome the inclusion of the new trajectory. I think it's very helpful in terms of looking at that overarching supply and where that supply is coming from. It's something that we asked for, and it welcomed that in there. I think what it does show is that strong supply in that 5 years. And it's difficult because it comes back to that point of could more be done later on in the plan period. And I think what we've heard from Mr. Delaney is that yes, it's the land supply that is the issue here. In terms of moving forward, not necessarily the market. And I think that is the fundamental point that we come back to with regard to the trajectory, is that there could be buffers, there can be, but actually without that land supply, we're never going to know whether we can deliver that level of homes. So whether it's a 9% buffer or a 0.1% buffer in terms of that, that's not really, in my mind, the issue in terms of that. There seems to be a strong supply in that first 5 years, but it's that trail off in terms of supply across the whole plan period. And that's the issue that needs to be addressed, I think, within this plan. And so really it goes back to last week's discussion on that, rather than this week, which shows a supply against 453, but it's that 453 that is the fundamental problem, I think, with regard to this plan. So I think that's where if we talk about non-implementation rates, I think what the council has, it's not about non-implementation, I believe, within this area. It is about sites coming forward and being delayed in terms of when they deliver and not delivering potentially at the rates that they come forward. So I think it's not about sites falling away. It's about actually how do we ensure those sites come forward quickly. That's about actually how do you, the pre-commencement conditions, all those sort of things, all those elements that go into the delay of sites. Obviously, there are clearly issues, and there can be issues in terms of finance, especially when you've got small developers coming through. There might be more difficulties in terms of those, but they're market issues rather than planning issues, as I think Mr. Long said. So, but it comes back to the fundamental point is that 453 and the supply against is meeting a 453 rather than looking again. But that's really from the discussion we had last week, Sarah, and you've got those points. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Mr. Gentleman, please.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, again, just echoing Mark's points and Ian's points as well. As I've said before, the whole argument about why we came to the 453 was all about the capacity of the Isle of Wight to deliver. Yet we're looking at figures in here that suggest in years 3, 4 and 5 and 6 that there's absolutely no problem with delivery. So I don't understand where that argument comes from. And as I said previously, I have no idea why we're trying to make a forward and progressive plan and we're accepting the fact that we're just going to diminish those numbers down for reasons that meet that 453 figure. It just doesn't make any sense at all to me. The allocations in here, again, are for in the main large sites. I know we're going to get into windfall later, but in between larger developers, there is very little in this plan for smaller developers, very, very little. And the smaller developers will be the larger developers of tomorrow. You need to grow that SME sector for this to work. But I can't find any rationale when you're looking at these numbers to say that the 453 number is correct, because surely this is counterintuitive to that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So who's going to go first in the captive corner? Mr. Pink or Mr. Delaney?
I'll check my sparring in first, shall I? I think in looking at a plan, we've got to look at the lessons or the failures we've had in the past. And I think, lack of allocation in the past has really caused perception to the public of great harm. So trying to get larger sites through this system and through political NIMBYism has been a real issue for us. It's really caused an element of delay, certainly with some of these larger sites we see here. To not have a consistent delivery of larger sites throughout this plan period, and I respect what James is saying, that we can look at 29 and a new plan may come forward then, but then are we not setting a plan that is going to fail on day one with this plan? Should we not be getting this plan right today instead of looking forward and saying that this is a hybrid plan? To me, it's setting expectations for the public. And the only way, and I know this afternoon we'll be talking about delivery of affordable homes, but the larger sites are the delivery of affordable homes on this island. We've seen in recent figures that delivery, and when I say larger sites, over 10 units, which frankly isn't very large, is under 50% of delivery on the island. So we're not delivering the whole picture, and the market needs to be stimulated throughout the whole process, from high end down to affordable housing here. And if we're not projecting large sites throughout this plan period, it will fail. We are looking at seeking 100% realistically with a very small buffer of success. I can guarantee you right now, you will not see success on 100% of those sites, or 109% of these, whatever the thing. There is a failure rate, and that's not from a plan process. That's from stuff outside our environment here as developers. And I think that buffer, as this gentleman like that, is it needs to be wider. Really needs to be wider.
Thank you. Mr. Delaney next, please.
You've covered part of what I was going to say, but that's right. Just to build on that point, really, of two elements: learning from the issues of the last plan, and respect what Mr. Brewer is talking about in terms of there'll be another plan. But the 2012 plan was reliant on area action plans coming forward to allocate land that ultimately didn't come forward and allocate the land. So to be back in a position where we're hopeful that a future plan will actually allocate the land we need to be successful doesn't feel like a particularly great place to be again. To build on James's point, the delivery, if we take the 23-24 year, delivery from large sites was just 118 units. That's 45% of delivery in that year. The first time in decades deliveries from large sites on the island has been less than 50%. If you take the prior 5-year average, delivery from large sites was running at 65%. That trend, I believe, is directly attributable to the lack of allocation of land and large sites identified for development. That was reflected in the independent peer review of planning services that was undertaken a couple of years ago, that specifically called out the lack of allocation of large sites as being one of the greatest barriers to the delivery of homes in general and specifically affordable homes. So this for us, to be able to have business continuity, to enable us to be consistently delivering the numbers required of homes, we have to have a strong and secure pipeline of large sites available to us. And currently, the land allocated in this plan does not achieve that. It achieves it in the next few years for sites that we've already got consented, where we've experienced the pain over the years gone, but it doesn't give us that platform moving forward. So within 2 or 3 years into this plan, we will be facing the same issues that we've been facing for the last 5, 10 years.
Thank you. Mr. James, next, please.
Thank you, sir. So the S in SHLAR stands for strategic, and I would suggest that the process we have here on the island, at least, is more reactive, and that we invite people to come forward with proposals for sites. But it's very inexpensive to do that, and it adds a lot of potential value to land. So actually, the incentive to build is not necessarily there as long as the potential to build exists in some notional sense, and that's what adds the value. And I suggest that's why sites, not just here on the island, but nationally, don't always come forward, is because once the added value is there, then the goal has already been achieved. And actually taking it to the next level is much more expensive. And where you have a lot of landowners who are land rich but cash poor, going to that sort of £50,000 investment to get outline planning permission or full planning permission is probably not a priority. And so I would suggest that the strategic housing allocation should be what it says it is, and that the council should be more proactive in actually identifying the best places for housing, rather than waiting for people who may or may not be interested in building housing to come to them, who are just seeking an uplift in value. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you for those. Before I move on to the next item on the agenda, I mean, I think a number of points have been made this morning that have been certainly put to us at other sessions. I think we're getting a clear message, certainly from the development sector, in terms of what they think some of the issues are. I'm obviously going to be reflecting on all the evidence we've heard over the last 2 weeks before we go back to the council after these hearings. But Mr. Brewer, is there anything particularly you wish to respond to from that last round of contributions?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just a couple of points, and I think I would just sound the warning that when we're talking about housing requirement, housing supply, and housing delivery, they are distinct things, and whilst they all have an interrelationship from a plan making perspective, they are different things. We touched on housing requirement and the impact of where that's set on whether we have a plan-led system or not, so I don't need to repeat any of that. But just, we do have large sites proposed for allocation in the plan, as shown on the trajectory. We've got 12 which are over 100, which obviously we're projecting to come forward at different stages of the plan period, so just to flag that. And I think, again, just a word of caution on the IDP, and in the 10 years post adoption of the IDP, in very different financial times with a whole host of allocations, we averaged 545 dwellings per year. So I think, again, just a word of caution in terms of looking back at a period which we're being asked in some ways to pick up and replicate here, that isn't necessarily the silver bullet. And again, that stepping stone, I think, is a really important context for this particular plan.
Okay, so just some clear on that point, Mr. Brew. You're saying in terms of was it 543? Is that following on from the unitary development plan or the core strategy? What period are you?
So in the period from 2001 to 2002, 2000 to 10, 11, it was an average of 545. So that's post UDP with all the allocations in it.
So could I just add a point, just in case in danger of being misunderstood. It was a point that Mr. Brewer had explained by reference to how the trajectory had been built up as a bottom-up trajectory. That's to say, looking at the individual sites and the profiles of those sites, and that presents the figures that you see. But what that didn't seek to do as part of that bottom-up process was, as it were, to tamp down or damp down delivery rates on individual sites by reference to those wider concerns that we raised in the earlier sessions about the capacity of the island market to support particular rates of delivery. So we think it wouldn't be appropriate to look, for example, at the individual years which show a figure of 680 or 700 or something, and then say, there you are, that shows it can be achieved, because those figures for those individual years don't seek to directly reflect that overall constraint, because they're bottom up site by site. And if you actually look at the overall figure rather than the figures year by year, and you look at the total, which there is the 6428, but it gets slightly dropped down by 25 units because of the Thetis road site. But if you actually average that out over the period there, it does in fact come in at round about just under the 500 per annum, which is broadly in line with what we have identified as the way that when you take those different lengthy periods of time and analyse the figures, whichever 5-year period you look at over whichever 15-year period you look at, so without regurgitating everything we were talking about last week, it's broadly in line with that. So I say we would say that you look at the trajectory and overall it actually fits with what the council's expectations are. So far as individual years are concerned, again, Mr. Brewer made the point, well, actually, we might find that some of those apparently well-performing middle years, some of that delivery actually gets pushed to later in the plan period. So that was a general point on the figures. And then just a final point, I know we're not going back into last week and all those arguments about what the requirement ought to be, but certainly for the reasons that we did rehearse last week, if there is to be, as it were, a concern about the island achieving an appropriate level of housing, we would say very much and very strongly that any mechanism to address that would be more directed to the supply side and the buffer side than it would be to the requirement side. So that the requirement, we think, is a proper reflection of what is achievable to address the island's needs. And if it were thought that more comfort is needed to assure the achievement of that requirement, then we would think that the remedy would lie more on whether or not one should do something about the scale of the buffer, which is the supply side, than by increasing the requirement to a level which we think would then lead us straight into the territory of it wouldn't be plan led, and there would be all those consequences we talked about last week.
Thank you. Understood. Without sort of reopening too much of last week's discussion, see that's kind of stimulated others to kind of want to come. If this could be a reasonably sort of focused or brief round, because I do want to come on to some of the other items on the agenda this morning. So again, in similar order. So Mr. Berrine first, then we'll work our way around.
It's very brief point just in regard to the period post UDP. I think that my understanding is the UDP had about an 8,000 home requirement, which is about 533 DPA per annum between 1996 and 2010-11. So what Mr. Brewer was saying about 580, I think, in terms of what the average delivery, I can't remember. 545. So actually what it was meeting the need that was identified in that plan. So it was planning for that need and met that need. So again, that it's just a reflection in terms of that it wasn't undersupplying against what was required. It was actually meeting what was required. So I think it's just a point of clarity, sir.
Councillor Jarman.
I like the word need a great deal. My interpretation, Nita, as you're probably aware by now, is quite different. To hear that something should be supply driven, I find quite surprising. I would assume that most housing issues would be need driven, and therefore the requirement would be defined by the need, and the plan that you would produce would be defined by that requirement. The logic of that seems very obvious to me. We are very clearly aware of what the need is here. We know what the population dynamics are, and we know what the missing gap is in terms of the housing situation. So having a plan that fulfills that would seem to be a great deal more sound and strategically directed than one that simply is supply driven and produces homes on a speculative basis. The whole idea of 453, which is what, to accommodate perhaps 1,100 new people a year, when the population dynamics are all forecasting for an annual decrease every year, seems completely absurd. Completely absurd. I mean, that is not need driven. There is no strategy behind that which reflects what the demand is on this island. That's purely speculative, and it must assume if the population of the island is itself going to go down, and that's a net basis based on imports and exports of people from and to the island and the birth and death rate, then it's an absurd way to go to say that something should be supply driven. It should be needs based. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Gentleman, please.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'll keep this very brief. It was just a point that Mr. Bedford raised, just in terms of the overall numbers here being about a spread of sites. And I'd just like to point out, when we're looking at the projected supply here, Westacre, Rosemary Vineyard, Hardcore Sands, and then into proposed allocations, Penny Feathers, are less than 3 miles from each other. To actually start adding those numbers up across those sites, so that's just a recap: Westacre, Rosemary Vineyard, Hardcore Sands, and Penny Feathers, less than 3 miles from each other, and then start adding those numbers up, and actually that's counter to what Mr. Bedford was suggesting about the spread of sites and the spread of those units across the island in terms of them going. Thank you.
Yeah, if I just be clear, I don't think I was making a geographic point in the comments that I was making. I mean, I see what is being said by Mr. Gentleman. I think my point about a spread of sites was a slightly different one, which was simply that you've got a series of numbers in there, but what we were explaining was that that's built up on a bottom-up basis, looking at them site by site, and not bringing in that wider island constraint. That was the point I was making. I can see the figures show a number of sites which are ride or ride related, and I'm not quarrelling with that, and I don't think I was making a point about that.
Yeah. Mr. Delaney, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in on the sort of the need point and give us a little bit of anecdotal evidence from what we actually see on the ground with delivering homes. The demand on the island, particularly amongst younger demographic, is huge. From the scheme we delivered recently, the first phase of Westacre Park in Ryde, we saw 50% of those homes go to first-time buyers and 80% to existing islanders. The first-time buyers typically were moving out of parental homes. So the need from that group was significant. That pent-up demand we see reflected with Westacre Phase 2, which in an ideal world would have rolled on directly from the delivery of Phase 1 several years ago. We have 800 active inquiries from island residents awaiting the delivery of homes in Ryde. So we have a tremendous backlog of local need for those houses. Can flip that to a scheme closer to here, just up the road at Horsebridge Hill. We're delivering a 100% affordable site, Acorn Farm, which you have in the numbers, in partnership with Sovereign Network Group. Last week, Sovereign released a press release explaining that some of those homes would be available for shared ownership, not launching shared ownership, simply announcing that they had some shared ownership coming. Over the weekend, post that press release on Friday, they had 114 inquiries, which their sales director described as unprecedented demand. On the back of that, they're not going to bother with a sales centre at the site because the need, the local requirement for those homes has been so overwhelming. We see that consistently in the affordable sector and from the younger elements of population across the sites we've delivered. So across the last 4 years, we've delivered sites in Rookley, God's Hill, Ryde, and now Newport. Every time we have released the affordable homes under the local lettings plan, 100% of those homes are gone within the first 3-month period to local need within the parish. The pent-up demand that we see for that is significant across every one of these sites. So I think the cause and effect of population demographic we see is we are losing young people from the island consistently because they cannot find appropriate housing.
Thank you for that. I was going to move on at this point in the agenda, but just mindful it's the council's plan. Is there any further you want to say in relation to what I've just heard? I think Mr. Bedford's kind of, yourself, Mr. Brewer, have kind of set out your stall before I heard those exchanges, but
Yeah, no, just one final point again, it's the point Mr. Leahy raised there, you know, household formation is the key thing when you look at need, it's not population, and they're very different things, and that's all set out in our housing needs assessment.
I'm going to move on to point 2 on the agenda. We'll be having a mid-morning break shortly, but I'm going to go through some of the bits and pieces in the actual trajectory itself. So I'm going to start with under part 1 of item 2 of our agenda. Obviously, the council has been able to recalibrate supply as of the 1st of April 2024 based on your latest monitoring data, Mr. Brewer. We've obviously covered that there are some sites, Medina Yard site has come out. Has anything else significantly changed? We'll come on to allocations shortly because I'm mindful some of those are in the planning process. But in terms of particularly the large sites over 100 that are specifically identified in the trajectory, do they all have detailed or an implementable consent, or are there any sort of wholly outline schemes in there?
Thank you, sir. No, so each of those sites, large sites permission over 100 dwellings, all have rentable planning consent. One of them obviously is split into, it's a hybrid application with some full and some outline, but obviously there's a clear indication there of direction of travel. In terms of the kind of, I guess, the update from kind of the rebasing the plan period to the 1st of April, obviously there were completions on sites with permission in 22, 23, 23, 24. So obviously they've all come out of that trajectory, so they don't appear. So that year 1, large sites with permission 146, 24, 25. Obviously that is kind of rebased, not taking account of anything that's kind of been delivered in the last 2 years. So it's entirely forward looking.
And in terms of those sites that are listed there, my assumption would be that the last site, last site, Scotland Farm, is already under construction.
That's correct, yeah.
That would help the maths to account for hopefully some of those units are built. And then in terms of some of the larger sites that are going to come forward and do some of the heavy lifting in years, particularly years 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, years 3, 4, and 5. Excuse me. We obviously referenced, and the West Acre Park site has come up. Previous discussions. I'm not going to go into the wherefores and what's currently running simultaneously to this plan examination. But in terms of how that site is profiled, a site that does currently have planning permission, you're looking at that site stepping up to deliver on average 50 units per annum. Is that a figure that's been provided to the council by the developer in terms of what they anticipate will come forward on that site? Is that one developer, or the two outlets? How, I guess it's the robustness of delivering consistently at 50 units on that site.
That is a single developer who are in the room. So but yeah, that is from information that kind of comes back and forwards from that developer in terms of their pipeline of sites. So again, that picks up that one, Acorn Farm and the Scotland Farm site as well, in terms of those trajectories. Yeah, I think in terms of then, if we kind of move down into that projected supply from proposed allocations over 100, and your point around kind of years 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, let's say, Obviously, a number of those sites are already in the planning process. So we've already talked yesterday around Somerton Farm and Somerton Reservoir. Obviously, there's a further site over the page in Bembridge as well, and another site in Newport Sylvan Drive. So a number of those kind of are already in the system, either with consent or about to get consent as well. So again, think around that point of the investment from those landowners, applicants into securing those planning permissions, and taking what information we can from planning statements, and as we've heard, and we'll probably come on to later on in the agenda, you know, setting trajectories at application stage is challenging, and things change. So in terms of the information we've got, the best available, that's where we've got those figures from.
Thank you. So that's helpful for me. So then Acorn Farm, I need to bear in mind that's also known as the Horsebridge Hill site. In terms of 60 units, and that's starting, well, potentially 60 units being delivered in this current year. Hoping that's a site that's currently under construction.
Correct, and I may defer to Captain.
Yeah, happy to answer on that one. I think the originally consented scheme is the 202. That is subject to a section 73 at the moment, which will reduce the number on that site to 145, which is what we would expect, you know, subject to the section 73 determination. But it is under construction. We'll have first occupations this summer, and that delivery rate is accurate.
Thank you for that. And then you referred to Mr. Brewer, obviously some sites that are now currently in the proposed allocations part of the trajectory, which we've discussed at various sessions. So the Somerton Farm, Northwood, West Medina regeneration area. I'm terrible on lefts and rights, but hopefully I'm okay on east and west. Somerton Farm, I think that's an outline consent. So it seems from the trajectory you're allowing a reasonable kind of lead in time from here on in to get reserve matters to a point of implementation. Is there somebody actively involved in that site in terms of, or is it being sort of promoted and then go to the market for reserve matters? Do you know?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there is some active interest in that site. Obviously, the landowner is very keen to secure the permission as soon as possible, and then take the site forward as quickly as possible. And there will be a number of routes of doing that. I think as a general point, what we've tried to do in the trajectory is look at the status of those applications, outline full, and try and apply a bit of logic to timescales needed to then potentially get reserve matters, go to the market, etc. So again, that figures in terms of where some of those sites kick in. But as we've already discussed this morning, very conscious that those dates can slip either way. It could be positive, you know, sites can come forward quicker than anticipated, and we haven't really touched on that this morning, but that obviously can happen as well. But sites obviously could also fall back for whatever reason.
I can work through from the Matter 6 statement. Is the Somerton Reservoir site, again, another site that's coming through the system? Is that an outline or a full application? Can you recall, Mr. Brewer?
That's a full application.
Thank you. Again, I note a similar kind of time frame for first delivery on that site. And then in terms of the other sites that are currently seeking to make their way through the planning system from what are currently proposed allocations, I think you referenced it, Sylvan Drive in Newport. I mean, that's again anticipated to start yielding delivery not this year but next year. Bit relatively modest numbers to start with. Again, is that realistic and come through a kind of a two-way process behind whoever's promoting that site?
That's our understanding from the applicants on that site. There is an early phase that can come forward and obviously lead into future phases on that site. Again, that's reflected in the trajectory.
And then finally, under the proposed allocations, we were discussing yesterday sites in freshwater. The final site on the list is the Camp Road site at 100 units, where the council, I think, was recently determined not to grant planning permission. Does that affect that trajectory, the council's point of view?
think from our perspective, obviously, we originally anticipated in early trajectories that site delivering a bit earlier, but obviously the decision in terms of refusing that, albeit not on principle, but on some technical grounds, which we believe can be overcome, reflects that kind of moving out in the trajectory to where it is at the moment. But again, that may be one of those sites that potentially goes further back, depending on whichever route the applicant decides to take on that. Obviously, they have the ability to appeal that.
And on the allocated sites, come back to penny feathers in Ryde. We obviously heard yesterday that the council has reflected, I think, more on the potential capacity of that site. In terms of the trajectory that's put forward, it's not anticipated to deliver within the next 5 years, and then really start to deliver in 2029-30 at an initial average of 80 units per annum, stepping up to 100 in the latter 3 years of the plan period. Ms. Goodyear, do you think that's a sound trajectory for your site?
We potentially think we could deliver earlier than that because we're coming forward with a hybrid application. So there'll be 80 dwellings that are in detail.
85, yeah.
85, sorry, in detail. So yeah, we'd be looking maybe April 27 delivery potentially. I mean, it depends obviously how long the application takes to be determined, but equally we've been working with the council for the last year in pre-act as well. So we'd hope that it's quite a quick process.
So you'd be suggesting to us a more optimistic trajectory for this site, earlier delivery. And over the longer term, is it still reasonable to be kind of looking at that kind of stepping up to 100 units per annum?
Yeah, I think that'd be reasonable.
Appreciate this is one of the larger sites that's put forward in the plan. I mean, at this stage, I mean, are you anticipating that would be 2 developers or 2 outlets side by side to get to that number?
In truth, we don't know at this stage at the moment because we're acting for the landowner as opposed to a developer. I'm involved in discussions on a weekly basis with 3 main developers who want to come back to the island. So they're in discussions there. There are other options of breaking up the site into smaller parcels for that to happen in a way small, medium builders could actually get involved on the site and generate that way. But at the moment, we're mainly focusing on the large builder breaking up the site.
Is the council or anybody else able to advise? I mean, has there been a site on the island that has previously yielded an average of 100 units per annum? Or is this potentially new territory, or no, there have been other?
No, there have been sites, and the Pan site is one in Newport, where obviously there were Barretts were involved there, and they did hit rates of that, and that's effectively why we took that in terms of obviously both the reps that were made through the Reg 19 process, and obviously recognising that site is one of the opportunities for a national house builder to kind of reappear on the island, and obviously their build out rates would be reflected in that trajectory.
Thank you. And can I obtain the council's view on what's been put to us that the trajectory for the Penny Feathers site could be? I use the word more optimistic, brought forward to earlier within years. 2027, so possibly year 4 rather than year 6, or even earlier, Ms. Goodyear. 2020.
I've not got it in front of me at the moment. I think I'm saying in 2 years' time. So is that year 3 or
Year 4.
Year 4. Yeah. Thank you.
Obviously, in the trajectory now, we're currently now in year, technically
year 4.
Year 2, so year 4.
Yeah, year 4.
I think I guess it depends on the content of the application. Obviously, as they've rightly said, we've been in pre-app conversations with the applicant, the promoters of that site for a while now. Obviously, depending on what format the application takes in terms of whether it's hybrid, how much goes into that early phase, and obviously then what happens to the rest of it. So obviously there are key considerations which we've still to kind of come to a view on, both in terms of potential layout and capacity and all those things that we touched on yesterday. So I think that's why, and as Mr. Farrell quite rightly referenced, you know, there are still conversations ongoing over how that site may be potentially delivered. So that's why we've taken the approach we have in the trajectory. But obviously you've got kind of our position and the promoter's position, and there may be a middle ground, but I think we're not too far away given where we are in the trajectory already. You know, potentially moving into year 2 from 1st of April 2025. So, you know, if you had a couple of years onto that to get through the planning process and then potentially start building and then complete, but I wouldn't suggest we'd be too far away.
Presumably on the submissions for Smallbrook developments, the overall outcome of that would be, because obviously 700 is anticipated within the plan period, but I think the capacity of the site discussed yesterday, at least 800, where it ultimately shakes out, I think it's probably something to think about. But my understanding from what Pennyfeather's, sorry, Smallbrook would be saying on Pennyfeather's sites, this could contribute more during the plan period. So if you brought this forward, you could add in another 100 or so over the plan period. Something to, I appreciate the council said to us not too long ago. I'm going to paraphrase. You know, we think the requirement is sound. If you were concerned about overall delivery and supply, that's the kind of the part of the equation we would encourage you as inspectors to kind of think about. And I just wonder whether the Pennyfeathers site is one possibility. If we were concerned about supply, if there was a more, so be close to like a more positive outlook on the site, this could yield some further. See.
Yeah, that's absolutely certainly one option, and I think, as you rightly said, the effect of that effectively got pulled forward. That number of 700 in the plan period would effectively be then increased by, you know, however many years it potentially comes forward and what capacity the site is. So I think from an LPA perspective, I think a key trigger point for us would be the submission of the planning application, and then obviously that allows us to give that consideration in terms of the formal content of that application, and then how we potentially see that fitting in with this.
I think we've raised at other sessions, there's obviously quite a bit going on potentially in this part of Ryde in terms of other sites. I hear from Mr. Pink, and then we probably will then have a break, mid-morning break. So Mr. Pink, please.
Thank you. I suppose just following on the point on the room and just looking at probably what you just touched on there, the geographical side of these sites are around Ryde and all within probably a 3-mile radius of each other. Delivery rates, I mean, we are probably the largest developer on the Isle of Wight, and we can achieve a sales rate of probably 1 per week. So 50 units a year. This is hence where we are talking from a delivery and from a sales rate there. As developers, we don't build for fun. We are commercial animals, and we do build to sell these houses. You've got a dilution of sales rate if you've got that many units all coming together. So if we looked at a year 6 plan there, we've got 238 units within that area there. One site that you claim is delivering 80 units a year. Now that's a very, very high sales rate, and I think it would be unachievable within that dilution of that sales rate within those 3 sites all delivering at the same time. So I do question that rate within that period. I totally understand it can come forward and can come back, but yeah, certainly pushing up to 100 units on the island is a very strong sales rate.
I mean, if we're concerned about that kind of dimension and kind of market appetite, can that be kind of balanced in any way in terms of we've got a plan that's been submitted to us here that's the council's position is going to deliver 400, and I think 453 is the realistic overall volume of housing that can be delivered, but within a context where I think even the council not disputing that the housing need on the island is 703. So already there's a potential, it's clearly a kind of a mismatch between the need and what's being provided. I heard a moment ago about kind of strong interest when sites and opportunities come forward. So it's trying to reconcile, is there this, people are clearly asking for more sites to be provided as part of this plan, whether there's kind of this pent up demand that will help delivery and enable the market to step up from more than what's currently being delivered to perhaps more buoyant weekly, monthly sales turnover? Is there any kind of
Yeah,
realism
there's
to
a
that,
conflict of
potentially?
all points there, really, isn't there? You know, there is a demand there. You know, we're seeing just on one site yesterday, last week, we sold 4 units. You know, so that's the sort of sales rate we're hitting is very high, really. We do need to build more, but to me, that leads more to that buffer. It's not a matter that the number's not needed. It's more that they're not all going to be delivered in that time period, basically. So, you know, even if we succeeded a sort of, and I'm going to use Pennyfeathers as the example here, you know, 80 units per year. If that dropped down to 60, for instance, from a real, you know, they're not going to build them for the fun of it. They've got to build to what the sales rate possibly can be. And, you know, that's just going to be extended out over this plan period. And it's a matter of that you need those buffers in, because we still need those sites and the wider site there. So I do understand your questioning of the sort of conflict of maybe my questioning on that, but equally the offering needs to be wider, I think.
Thank you. And from your sort of Mar Island sort of history and activity, Mr. Pink, I mean, when we're getting to kind of figures of 80 to 100 units a year, is that realistically two developers, two outlets to kind of get to that?
We've seen the likes of national house builders delivering that sort of numbers. It's physically possible, as in to build the units there. You know, I don't see any barriers to delivery from an actual construction side. But then you've got the mix of affordable versus open market, and obviously affordable. There's a huge demand on there, so we can build more affordable units. So you can certainly achieve those numbers by pushing that affordable element up. But then equally, you've got the constraints of, you know, what housing associations do we have on the island who are active.
We'll come on to some of that this afternoon. If I can hear from Miss Goodyear next, then Mr. Gentleman, then Mr. Long, and then break for a mid-morning break. So Miss Goodyear, please.
So it was only just a quick point, is that obviously Pennyfeather scheme, there will be affordable housing delivery as well, which will add to those numbers.
Mr. Gentleman next, please.
Thanks very much. I wholeheartedly support the Pennyfeathers application. I think it's a good scheme. It's a nice site and well presented. But I have to say that looking at the back end of this plan, when we're pushing everything out to look at such a significant proportion of homes coming from one site, seems again to put a big point of weakness into the possible delivery. And every which way I sort of look at this, it's just sort of a death by 1,000 cuts, because in every angle there's possibilities to fail. You know, I wish Pennyfeathers every success, but to achieve 100 units a year from one site on the island is a very significant number, even with multiple developers working on one site, which is not something we've seen massive success of on the island over history. Thank you.
Mr. Long, yes, no?
I think just tying into all of it, we're talking about a very tight-knit northeastern cluster of sites. It's not a problem with the sites per se at all, but just kind of the underbelly of the plan and the spread geographically. For instance, you know, the northeastern quarter spread of these sites probably have little tangible effect on delivery in Bembridge, and in a mainland scale that would seem quite close, but actually one of the plan points in here is the island's got its own uniqueness. But if you had, it comes back to the allocations of more sites slightly further away, doesn't become a problem in housing delivery terms. So I don't think you need to be, it just comes down to that that point, more allocations in the delivery in geographic spread against settlement hierarchy would alleviate that market pressure for this quite small bubble, which is very unique in the plan. Because I mean, there's probably a bubble in Newport that will occur, but it's a slightly different market as well. So yeah, just advocating the spread and settlement hierarchy.
Thank you. Mr. Farrell, very brief point. Yep.
Extremely brief. Just looking on the numbers and things, is we've actually got a 9-year period on 80 units per year, which delivers the 80 units, 800 units. So it does go to that. But on a further point, Penny Feathers is slightly unique in as much that it has a very strong vein along its Brading Road frontage, which allows 2 developers to work, and that is the strategy of the sales that we're looking at the moment. Certainly conversationally, that's what we're looking through.
Thank you. Keen to take mid-morning break, as I will give the councillors anything further you want to say when we come back, but it's just gone 25 past 11. If we could be back in this room at 20 to 12, please. I think somebody's already mentioned windfall, so we're going to come on to that very shortly when we return, but if we can be back in the room, please, at 20 to 12. Thank you. Okay, it's just come up to 20 to 12. So I'm going to resume this local plan examination hearing session, please. We were just coming to the end of item 2 on the agenda. I don't know, Mr. Brewer, whether there's anything you wanted to respond to on what I just heard around delivery and the emphasis on particular focus on ride.
I think other than it probably just kind of supports the approach we set out at the start, that we've kind of taken that bottom up approach trajectory. Obviously, there will be commercial decisions over market, market viability in terms of sales rates, etc. But that's not something that's control of the LPA. So yeah, I think that's just reflective of that point.
Thank you for that. So if we move on to item 3 on our agenda, please. The trajectory makes an allowance for windfall as being a component of supply over the plan period. And I think the council's confirmed in response to our MIQ 7.5 that what's presented in the trajectory and the windfall is a blend of small sites, less than 9 units or less, with planning permission and unanticipated supply over the plan period that could come through from a variety of sources. And the figure that the council's presented is 100 units per annum consistently over plan period. I wonder if I can first invite Mr. Brewer to set out the rationale or the understanding for that figure, because I think you say from your monitoring it's higher, but you're taking a potentially more sort of cautious approach, kind of recognising the wider policy framework in the submitted planning strategy.
Thank you, sir. And yeah, that's correct. And I say, draw people's attention to our response to MIQ 7.5 in our Matter 7 hearing statement. So as a steer for those who haven't got it in front of them, the delivery from those sites of kind of 9 units or less, we've looked back over the last 8 years. The average is 158 a year from those, and that's split between sites from 5 to 9 and 0 to 4. So, it does form a key part of supply on the island, but we are also conscious that we are changing, I guess is what's been described over the last week as the SP1 approach in terms of land immediately adjacent assessment boundaries. So that potentially adds a more restrictive policy approach. So from our perspective, reducing that or having a slightly more conservative windfall estimate across the plan period is appropriate and talks to that perhaps more restrictive policy approach, which obviously is conjunction with allocations and certainty that they will provide. So yeah, I think that's our evidence on that. It's clear in terms of those completions. And I think again, the split between 0 to 4 and 5 to 9 is important as well, whilst we haven't kind of gone down to that granularity in terms of that breakdown in the windfall supply. Again, as you can see from the figures in the table, the 0 to 4 units can often exceed over 100 units a year. Now, obviously, they come forward all across the island, different locations. There's no pattern necessarily to it. Some come forward within settlements, some outside. So the real mixture, really. So what we've tried to be is take a sensible and pragmatic approach to what is a key element of supply on the island.
Thank you. So when we're looking at the 153 figure from council's past monitoring, sorry, 158 as the average. That's wholly from kind of smaller sites. So there are no, ideally in a plan-led system, there are no large windfall sites, but they, despite all best efforts to find them, they do come out the woodwork. So that figure is not potentially skewed by any kind of larger windfall sites that may have come through the SP1, the core strategy SP1 route.
No, it's not. So all of those figures in that table in our response to 7.5 are sites of 9 units or less. There's nothing in there from larger sites.
And in terms of going forward, in terms of the trajectory, that 100 figure is a blend of small sites currently have planning permission and an anticipated kind of supply on smaller sites. Is there any way the council, or does the council have the information to kind of tease those apart in terms of, do you know, presumably you know now through monitoring what's currently got planning permission on small sites? And I think you say further in answer to question OMIQ 7.5, you know from your latest monitoring position that cumulatively comes to 226, which I think quite reasonably will say will kind of hopefully largely materialise within the next 4 years. So could you present that as a separate line rather than blend everything together and then windfall genuinely something else, you know, is the unanticipated supply going forward?
That would be another way of representing it, and I guess that would align with how it's often presented in kind of housing and land supply statements, where you have that kind of 5 to 9 category. I think what we tried to do is really simplify kind of the sources of supply in policy H1. So we just had those 3 distinct areas: so allocations, large sites with permissions, and windfalls. So from a policy perspective, I think we're comfortable that those 3 key sources of supply are appropriate. Obviously, we if the inspector so decide, we could provide some more granularity, whether that's in supporting text or appendix. But I think from our perspective, we're comfortable that, and again, as you quite rightly pointed out, so the windfall, there may be sites over 10 that come forward. You know, there are a number of sites which have historically, I'm sure everyone in the room can think of sites on the island which have been sat there for a very, very long period of time and nothing's happened on them. Some of them brownfield sites in settlements that just haven't moved. Suddenly something could happen that could come forward and deliver 20, 30, 40 units. So I think from our perspective, that obviously would also be a windfall development, according to the spatial strategy of the plan, if it's within assessment boundaries. So I think we're comfortable with that kind of umbrella windfall term.
So we have provided in ED3A, you know, the annual position statement at 1st April 2024, Appendix 3 of that does give you the supply from small sites, the 5 to 9s, with planning permission in terms of their expected delivery profile. But because historically that's looking at a 4-year plan period, it only gives you it for years 1 to 4 rather than 1 to 5. But effectively, you've got that information split out there. And I think we would certainly make the point, because what we've not done is, which you do sometimes see plan makers do, is double count those small sites and the windfall allowance, whereas we haven't done that. But you can effectively, for example, if you take 24-25 in Appendix 3, it gives you a figure of 71, which would imply that effectively there's only 29 others in that. And then for the following year, it gives a figure of 85, then it gives a figure of 62. And so you can already see that split that you were asking for. I mean, obviously, if you wanted us to provide it in a different line in the trajectory, we could, but you may feel that actually when you've looked at those figures, that gives you a sufficient feel for it, that actually you perhaps don't need a further line. We leave that with you.
Thank you. I mean, I think it is that issue, Mr. Bedford, around potential double counting, and ordinarily windfall, when you see windfall in headline term in years 1 to 3 of a trajectory, nervousness starts to set in around double counting, and it's whether the council had the information, even if the figures are ultimately, when it kind of shakes out from that Appendix 3 of ED3A, actually it's not that significantly different, because you've got a consented supply that's broadly the same figure, provides that assurance that there isn't a significant degree of double counting. And then what goes forward from year 3 or 4 genuinely is kind of small scale windfall. We'll certainly look again at that Appendix 3, and if we remind that actually we do want a bit more on a separation within the trajectory, that's something we can obviously recommend.
I guess just to add to that, so again, you know, if we're in that dream position of post-plan adoption, then regular housing and land supply statements on an annual basis become a lot simpler because you're then dealing with the known of what's in the plan, etc. And so obviously we can present those in the way that we have done historically, which may provide the transparency, if you like, and just the comfort there is no double counting.
Thank you for that. And obviously the test in the National Planning Policy Framework is around compelling evidence to include a windfall allowance. And obviously the council's gone back and looked at what's happened. I mean, has permitted development rights, particularly in relation to commercial to residential, has that been a issue for the island, or you largely been immune from that?
We've seen some, but not great numbers, I think is probably the best way of summarising that. So there have been the odd scheme, but we haven't seen some of the larger kind of office to resi schemes that you might have seen in other areas. But and again, I think in some ways that may take a bit of time to feed through, but also in terms of whether the kind of stock of buildings that would be appropriate for that on the island as well is probably a bit more limited than other areas.
And in terms of sustaining windfall going forward, obviously identified as kind of a suite of policies that apply outside of settlement boundaries. I'm also mindful windfall will also occur inside settlement boundaries, but in terms of the in combination effects, I think it's policies H4, H6, H7, H9, H10, degree to which they could meaningfully contribute to that windfall supply. It seems to me from the council's kind of approach, you've looked at what's happened in the past and then kind of scaled down. I guess I'll invite others to the reasonableness of that approach. That if the council's kind of got the evidence from monitoring as to kind of actually in the past, a lot of our windfall has materialised within built up areas within the settlements, therefore a more restrictive approach outside the settlement boundaries, the degree to which that will materially affect windfall going forward.
Thank you, sir. And I guess the short answer is yes. You know, we do look at the monitoring information and where those kind of small sites come forward. There is a significant proportion that comes forward within settlement boundaries. There is a proportion outside as well. So I think the summation is that our windfall allowance in the plan is reflective of the spatial strategy of the plan, and also obviously where some of the other policies that would allow development to come forward. So we think it's an appropriate kind of marker point really in terms of that 100 a year, given the spatial strategy and given the policies that we've got within the plan.
Thank you. And I appreciate others have made points on windfall and how the policy framework will fit together to kind of sustain windfall going forward. So we'll hear from Mr. Long first and then Mr. Gentleman, please.
Thank you, sir. I suppose you stole some thunder, what I was going to say, in terms of the devil's in the detail. So, you know, historically, the island has worked quite well, I would say, with smaller builder developers, and they kind of blend their cash profile against being kind of the builder and also the developer, and being quite successful. But that group, because I'd say the planning system just in general nationally has become a little bit more challenging, seen a little bit of a shift away from it, but we still got the ability to nurture the next generation coming up. Once you start to blend the new plan policies, and I completely accept the point that inside settlement boundaries, you're going to get a good share of windfall coming forward, which the plan certainly allows for. But once you start to interlace and grapple with what we do with, say, the PDL and the E policy for protection of 1,000 square metres above, the H4 infill policy, which I think is a good thing, but then outside settlement boundaries, you have H6, which is basically a mirror of MPPF. I can't remember what iteration, the 24 version, whether it's paragraph 84, 88, I can't remember, but you know, they're fairly rare commodities in housing windfall supply. Rural and first homes exception sites, they do happen, but again, very rare. And they don't naturally align themselves to the builder developers or growing smaller SMEs. You know, it's a very unique policy, probably lending itself to the RPs or similar. You then have the PDL point, and you know, maybe we'll touch on these factors in afternoon session about the intricacies of the policy. And then we have self and custom built housing, which is a market I think can be tapped into, but again, it's not going to lead to significant volumes of supply. I think there's going to be remnants of the SP1 territory where the first phase of the year's supply will probably reach the council's targets, but once the SP1 supply dwindles, you then get into the mainstream policies, and then I suppose the challenge is how do you continually feed how the islands performed successfully well against a very, I'd say, more challenging set of policies for the smaller builder developers to operate in, and the link that those build. I would see a decline in that rate, which is something that we should definitely not encourage, given say for instance, Captiva's experience, you know, started small several years ago, and now they're the biggest house builder on the island. You know, we need to encourage that younger generation to come through. I'm not sure that those policies through the windfall supply are going to achieve that. So they are very much interlinked, and that comes back to kind of the thing to grapple with against G2 and the settlement hierarchy. I know we talked about that last week, but the supply, I feel, with the policy structure will drop off in subsequent years once these policies embed in windfall supply, which is certainly something we should not encourage.
Thank you. Mr. Gentleman, next, please.
Thank you. We heard earlier on that smaller developers, builders have typically taken up between 50 to 40% of the supply on the Isle of Wight. So if we're taking the 453, that's somewhere between 180 to 225 units a year. I see in this plan, looking at it as a smaller developer builder, I don't see anywhere for me to go. As David's rightly pointed out, you know, self and custom build and first homes, rural exception, they're slightly different policies, but they're not policies that a smaller developer builder can operate successfully and turn a margin in. So that doesn't work for us per se. Taking away the immediately adjacent from SP1, which has previously allowed settlements to grow, and of course the hierarchical structure that we've discussed, which has taken away that ability for those other settlements to grow. You know, it really doesn't leave any scope for us. And when I look at the plan and when I look at what's here, there is nothing in this plan for the smaller developer or builder. You know, I take the point that James Brewer's made about brownfield sites within town centres. However, I would say that the strain on viability due to widely publicised increase in build costs have tipped the viability even further away from many of those sites. And when I look at the projections that's in here, you know, 100 units per year, against an average of 158, and I look at the decline, you know, those limitations, no SP1 immediately adjacent, hierarchical structure changed, and then we look at where those opportunities lie, and in my opinion, they just don't exist, and that's a real problem. You know, there is, and I've said it before, there isn't anything in this plan for the smaller developer builder to operate in. And that's a real concern. You know, we need to be growing the SME sector within the development industry. It's a vital part of supply, and it has been historically an absolutely vital part of our island supply. And, you know, typically operating at a smaller scale, you know, we operate on a very personal level with our clients, and we do a very different type of product from that of larger house building. And there is space and need in the market for both of those things to exist, but there isn't anything in this plan that enables that sector to continue working effectively. David's pointed out that, you know, within the sector, we're not widely sophisticated in the way that we operate. You know, we're smaller cottage industries, if you like. And actually the planning process is harder and harder to navigate. And without clear allocations in here, there is a real lack of confidence for us to invest in that and try and continue with our businesses. Thank you.
Without getting sort of too specific about who builds what and your kind of building models, I mean, Mr. Long referred to it a moment ago. I mean, one of the policies that would be an avenue to windfall is self-build, custom build. I mean, I appreciate that takes many different forms and approaches. Is that an emerging or developing sector that could provide part of the evidence base for kind of compelling evidence that this windfall rate can be met?
Self and custom build housing is a route to affordable home ownership. You know, that's its purpose in planning policy. You know, the purpose is that you're setting out, allowing for individuals to self-build their own houses. They have to have involvement with design in terms of, you know, for that to fit within the definition. And that means that that really is focused on the self-builder. I think it's a really important part of supply, which again, there isn't an allocation in this plan for that self and custom build route. But that isn't something that the traditional smaller builder developer operates within. You know, typically we are operating and building out our own consents for our customer base. You know, we're not working with householders to deliver a more affordable route to home ownership. And let's be clear about that. That more affordable route to home ownership through self and custom build occurs because they are retaining the developer's profit. That is allowing them to have a more affordable project home in the marketplace. And it's a vital and important part of it, but it is very different from the smaller builder take-up.
Mr. Berright next, please.
Thanks, sir. It's kind of shoehorn a point really within into the agenda. I think it's related to the 10% in terms of the small building and windfall. Note in paragraph 7.12, the council says 32%, but that includes a windfall figure within that small sites. And obviously paragraph 70 of and related to the paragraph 78 and related to that 10% for small sites is identified through the development plan or the brownfield register. And that's a windfall site isn't technically identified, and that comes back to the glossary points within the MPPF, which specifically states that windfall sites not specifically identified in the development plan. So it still means that on the calculations that 10% on the 453, but if you were minded in terms of looking at beyond that, that there may well be a shortfall in that 10%. And I think this goes to a point that Mr. Gentleman was raising in terms of the support in terms of allocations for small sites within the within this plan. I think against the 453, there's 10%, but if it was to be higher in terms of, say, against the 703, just as I think then it would fall short because of the inclusion of that windfall. So it's a minor technical point, sir, in terms of the definition of windfall within relation to that 10%, but one I just wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you've reminded me about our question 7.4, which kind of slightly skipped over, but I think it has an overlap with this kind of discussion we're having now in terms of the potential of smaller sites to contribute to supply. And I think, yes, obviously that part of the MPPF is specifically about how reflecting that small and medium-sized builders have the kind of the capacity to quickly respond and provide homes sooner, quicker than perhaps other parts of the housing supply picture. Just on the, I mean, Mr. Barron's kind of taken us there before I bring in others on wider sort of windfall and ability to kind of support smaller sites. On the question, response to our question 7.4, I think the council says on its figures, it will meet the requirements of MPPF paragraph 70 on the December 2023 version. Mr. Barron's obviously done the maths. If you strip out windfall, you're still at in excess of 10%. I think you've identified in your response there, Mr. Brewer, the kind of various allocations, appreciate they're not specifically identified in the trajectory as a single line because obviously they're under the 100 units, but there's anything further you just want to briefly say in response to MIQ 7.4, kind of helping to provide a range of kind of smaller, medium sites in addition to windfall?
Thank you, sir. And yeah, just to, I guess the starting point on that question is obviously the approach which we discussed last week in terms of the decision of the plan to kind of only allocate sites of 10 or over. So within the realms of that framework, there are, I think, 8 sites allocated of under a hectare in size. There are currently 9 sites, 9 large sites of planning permission, so 10 units or more under 1 hectare, and those combined yields between them 176 and 129, and obviously adding in the windfall as well, which was been touched on in point. So we're comfortable that the plan as presented provides that 10% buffer. Obviously, we fully acknowledge the conversations we had last week around that approach and the allocations that don't appear in the plan below 10, and obviously inspectors will come to their own view on that. So and just before perhaps I'll pass back to you, just to opportunity to quickly at maths while others were talking. So completions from sites under 10 units within settlement boundaries: 23-24 137, 22-23 98, 21-22 110. So I think that demonstrates there is supply from that location. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can bring in others, I hear from Mr. Pink, then Councillor Jarman, then Mr. James. So Mr. Pink first.
Thank you, sir. My commentary on this is fairly brief, really, but really offering support to Mr. Gentleman and how important that SME sector is. This year is my 25th anniversary of developing on this island, and from the range of very small all the way up to where we're category is today. But it is such an important part of the marketplace to develop on the island, that SME marketplace, and the plan needs to offer a wide range of availability for all parts of that. We need to stimulate the market all the way through. There's not one solution. The one solution is not large sites, and it might be self-builds to the other extreme. But we need to stimulate the market all the way through there, and there needs to be a wide-ranging solution to look forward and plan forward. Otherwise, the plan will fail.
Thank you. Councillor Jarman, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a major opportunity for windfall, and particularly in within development boundaries. And what our community has very much tried to support is tying in windfall delivery with regeneration. And I can easily see many of our high streets, which are suffering terribly at the moment, having upstairs 1 or 2 level apartments being introduced, perhaps using it as an opportunity to reinstate shop fronts beneath them. That has a delivery bonus, but it also means the regeneration of that high street is brought into play as well. So it can be a very good economic benefit. Likewise, in terms of larger developments, we'd be heralding very much the model which was Green Meadows, 75 apartments delivered in 1 block, very much supported by the community, very much meeting an immediate need. So these opportunities are there. They're not always small. I've given you an example of a very small one and a relatively modest one. So they are there, and I think windfall can play a very large part. Tying it in with regeneration has those additional benefits. And we all know that there are large areas of this island which are not greenfield, but are towns and town centres and high streets, and they need regeneration. And that upstairs conversion route is one way of delivering it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. James, please.
Thank you, sir. Following up on Mr. Gentleman's points, I think the question of making the settlement boundary very hard is probably a mistake. These are arbitrary lines which reflect past development, not necessarily current or future needs. And so if you have a site outside the settlement boundary by little, or continuous with it, that doesn't meet any of the special criteria for rural housing, but happens to be well situated for schools, employment, public transport and vehicle access, why in principle would that be a bad thing to permit for development, especially in a context of under delivery of housing up to this point? And on the point about self-building, someone who has land who's well capitalised and has sufficient skills and experience to project manage a house build or even physically build it themselves with their hands. These people are the unicorns of the planning system. In our work, we meet very few people who can sort of tick all of those boxes. And usually people do need the assistance of an experienced developer or planner or builder to get them there. So in this country, we don't really have a culture of people specifying and building their own houses. And so I think while it's very encouraging to see support for self-build, it's always going to be a very small part of the solution, especially in a place with an older demographic where people are not really ready to take on a project lasting many years later in life, where they're looking for something that meets their needs and will, be as easy as possible for them to move into. And also on the Equality Act front, there are a lot of people with complex needs and disabilities who need custom built housing because the market doesn't really provide what they need. But they're probably not going to be self-builders because they're not necessarily in the building trade themselves or have the relevant practical skills to do that. So in theory, it's possible, but that's going to be a very, very small part of the market.
Thank you. I think there's some issues that are rising today that kind of have a bit of an overlap with the discussions we've had in week one around the spatial, I'm going to call it the spatial strategy, but it's policy G2, resisting the urge to call it GS2, G2, which is something we've gone into our kind of melting pot of things we want to kind of reflect on. So I think some of the points that have been raised today echo what we've heard earlier. Keen, obviously, we stick on the issue of kind of windfall. The council, I think, set out its position of why it's, I think, so 100, the allowance of 100 is supported by compelling evidence. So further, I don't think we'd want to ask of the council at this stage. Is there anything further, Mr. Brewer, you wanted to pick up on windfall that you haven't addressed in your statement or response to points that have been raised?
The only thing I was going to mention was obviously if it would help in terms of providing that further evidence, we're more than happy to provide that detailed breakdown of perhaps the similar period we've got in our answer to 7.5 of how many of those windfall units came forward within settlement boundaries. We'd be more than happy to add effectively a column underneath that if that would be of assistance, just to provide you with that further information.
I'll say yes to that now. I've made notes of the figures you've put just to make sure I've got probably something I would go back to the council anyway to just double check that my notes are accurate. But yes, if you can provide that, Mr. Brewer, that would be helpful. No immediate urgency on that, but there's lots of other things going on, but I'll add that to the list of some pieces. Thank you. Just mindful of time and other things that we need to sort of cover as part of this session. So item 4 of the agenda, and I think we've kind of partly been here in terms of set out at the start the kind of the needs to kind of have a deliverable supply on plan adoption, which in terms of the planning practice guidance is the year one would be year of point of plan adoption, which is 2025. 26, and I'm quite clear from the council's evidence and position that if the figure of 453 is found sound, I think the council's view is you are comfortably in a position of demonstrating a deliverable supply, which I heard on numerous occasions is one of the drivers that the council wants from this planning process. So I don't think there's anything further specifically I want to pick up on agenda item 4, unless there's anything further that the council wanted to bring to our attention on that.
No, I say we think we cover it off in our answer to MIQ 7.6 and the conversations we've already had.
Thank you. Probably deduced from others around the table that if you took a different approach, either a different plan period, not necessarily a different plan period, but certainly a different housing requirement figure, then we probably would be in different territory, and that would be something we would have to go back to the council on and say, how do we how do we look at this? Okay, and in terms of the trajectory in Appendix 1 that the council provided, and we've touched upon this. I mean, I appreciate people have got kind of views on the strength of the council's pipeline, particularly in years 3 through to 8, and kind of peaking in year 6 at a healthy just shy of 750, and then significantly kind of reducing over the balance of the plan period. I mean, our assumption is the council wants to be measured against a constant requirement figure of 453, and not proposing any kind of stepped trajectory that you want to be initially measured against a higher figure and then stepping down towards the back end of the plan period. Is that how we should be looking at things, Mr. Brewer, on a constant basis?
Yeah, that's certainly our view, that that constant requirement is justified for all the conversations we've had this morning and last week around the nuances and idiosyncrasies of the housing market and delivery market, and supply and delivery being different things, albeit one comes from the other. They are different things.
Thank you. Are there any further points people wish to make specifically in relation to the trajectory before I move on to kind of other matters around incentivising delivery? No, I think everybody's hopefully had an opportunity to get their key points across. So if I come to item 6 on the agenda, I think this has been can I describe it as a perennial theme that's kind of emerged through various sessions that we've had at this examination to date, is around implementation and delivery. I think the council is obviously alive to this and has put within the plan policy G5 as part of its growth or suite of policies in terms of delivering growth, and in particular ensuring that permissions are delivered. So a number of sites obviously have planning permission that have not yet started or fall out of the system, hopefully come back in at an appropriate point, or maybe have got outline, but then there are issues around getting reserved matters. Obviously, the National Planning Policy Framework is quite clear about boosting housing delivery, improving housing choice, particularly in delivering good quality homes and affordable homes. In terms of policy G5 from the council's perspective, is it justified? Will it be effective in terms of what the council's seeking to secure in terms of ensuring that what does get planning permission will come forward and will help meet housing need, and including what the council itself has described in the plan as the acute need for more affordable homes? Mr. Brewer.
Thank you, sir. And our belief is that yes, it is justified and effective. And you mentioned national planning policy, and paragraph 79 and 81 of the NPPF talk to this particular issue in detail. So I think this is part of the package, and all the conversations we've had last week and this week around delivery, and potentially some of the challenges that the island faces. Obviously others may disagree, but part of that package, and again in the plan, thinking about section 10, which we'll come on to tomorrow, and obviously the kind of trigger within section 10 around delivery of housing, we just felt it was really important for us to then be able to get a real grip on those sites coming forward through the plan, and those allocations which don't yet have planning applications, or potentially different planning applications may come in. So we're able to do that monitoring exercise, and if delivery on the island does have that uptick and exceed 453 for 3 years in a row as set out in section 10, we'll be able to know about that very quickly, and then that triggers that plan review point, albeit obviously we've also got the national position on plan review as well. So I think from our perspective, it is justified. That information is vital to us to undertake that kind of ongoing monitoring and kind of almost scrutinising what's coming forward and where. Obviously, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act also has commentary on this and provisions for this as well. So in some ways, we're talking to that as well. And I think, I guess my final point on this is proportionality. That's key. We fully understand and respect, as we've heard this morning, that the challenges in kind of fixing delivery timetables are understood. We get that. We get that things change, and obviously this can only ever be that snapshot in time with that application, and things will change. But it is important for us, and I think we've heard from colleagues this morning across the other side of the room that actually trajectories provided can be met. They can be stuck to, and they can be accurate. But obviously, we also appreciate that those things can change as well. But I think the overarching point from us is that we need this kind of information to enable us to then accurately kind of almost enact Section 10 and the triggers in the plan.
And in terms of that evidence and information, I will invite others to contribute on this. In sort of in the second part of the policy, you're saying that council through this policy would not approve an application unless there is sufficient evidence provided. Is the council clear what that kind of evidence we'd be looking for through this policy?
It's difficult to be precise because the evidence will potentially differ on a site-to-site basis. You know, as we've discussed this morning, there are a whole myriad of reasons why sites permissions don't get implemented, some of which are fully in control of the applicant, some of which are not. And so I think it's difficult for us to be precise, but it would obviously be very related to that particular site and to that application and the specific reasons, and the council would have to take a view at that time as to whether it considered what those reasons were and the kind of evidence behind them.
Thank you. I think allied to that, just looking at part criterion D for major residential developments, again, you're looking for evidence to demonstrate that different market housing products on a site can compete in the market at the same time. Again, just thinking about the sort of practical implementation of that policy and the source of evidence that the council would be seeking from potentially some of the people sitting around the table to satisfy that particular criterion. Have you given thought to that, Mr. Brewer, in terms of what you might be seeking?
Yeah, I think we actually touched on it earlier this morning, really. I think Mr. Pink raised the point when we're talking about Ryde and the different sites in and around Ryde and the quantum of development that may come forward there. There will obviously be a commercial decision to start building, and that commercial decision will be kind of backed up by what that product is. So, you know, in terms of the application stage, what type of housing is it housing delivery? Is that application proposing to deliver? How does that sit with potentially other sites that are coming forward in an area? And again, we're just trying to give ourselves as much opportunity as possible to make what we've got in the plan as successful as we can.
So through this policy, if a proposal came forward from a business kind of market perspective, but council took a view, well, we might be concerned this is kind of saturating this part of the island with a particular housing product that would potentially maybe set some alarm bells around deliverability, that would be the basis of potentially refusing a planning application if you can't negotiate an alternative kind of mixed provision.
I think we'd be having that conversation with the purpose of that is then to have that conversation and say, okay, what's coming forward is product X. There's already lots of product X going on. Are you comfortable and satisfied that there is a demand for that? And we've heard this morning around kind of pent up demand and that kind of evidence as well. So it's that combination of factors that we're looking to just make sure that when we effectively almost release a site through a permission, that it's got the best chance of succeeding as possible, given that things can change.
And then ultimately, final points for me for the council before I open up to others. Then ultimately through the policy, there are various kind of backstops, which I think which reading the policy will rest with the council itself. So you'll either potentially step in with compulsory purchase if necessary, depending on the scheme. I think my question to the council is, the extent to which the council at the moment has an appetite for CPO, whether this be kind of newer territory and resource and ability to do that. And then secondly, issue completion notices appreciate you're reflecting the legislation through the Levelling Up Regeneration Act that kind of gives you those powers. But again, just understanding the council's kind of yes, the council's understanding of the extent it will kind of use those powers, and as an authority, has the council recognised what could flow from this policy? Mr. Bolter.
Thank you, sir. Short answer is yes. I think it's been quite clear through this process around where this could go, and I think this goes some way, I think, to emphasise the council's increasing recognition of its role in housing delivery and tackling some of those wider issues across the island that are associated with lack of delivery. And I think we've also seen, even since the plan was submitted to you, that there's been a lot of movement nationally around CPO, when that might be appropriate, and the routes through. So I think there's an awareness locally and the potential for an increased willingness to tap into more of the tools that the local authority is being given by government.
Thank you. If I can turn to others round the table, so we can start with Miss Goodyear first, then Mr. Gentleman, Mr. Delaney, Mr. Long, in that order, please.
I think, thank you, sir. You've asked quite a lot of the questions that I had about this policy, and but I think I still remain quite concerned, because effectively penny feathers would be caught by this, because we have an expired consent because the reserve matters were refused, which feels a little unfair in this situation. And I'm also just concerned about what is going to be sufficient evidence, and that the council could be suggesting they would then refuse an application on that basis if it's allocated in the plan. Just seems a little bit crazy to me and counterintuitive to what the policy is trying to achieve in terms of delivery. But I just, yeah, it makes me very nervous that this could sit in an adopted plan like this. I think it will create problems for the future. I understand the need to kind of try and understand delivery, but I'm not entirely sure this is the best way to do it. Criteria D, for instance, if you're looking at an outline planning application, I just don't know how you're going to answer some of those questions.
Thank you. Mr. Gentleman, next, please.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think Ms. Goodyear's just echoed some of the very valid points on this. So I think first thing is 6.33 acknowledges that this isn't a situation that's unique to the Isle of Wight. We know that we are a periphery area, the Isle of Wight, in terms of value and our economics, and we've discussed that in other sessions. I just think that this sets a very worrying tone about providing the confidence to invest in permissions on the Isle of Wight. And given the commentary at 6.33, yes, we all accept the national direction of travel with this, but this feels quite unnecessary as a policy. I think if we're looking to control the delivery of the permissions in terms of how they're delivered, well, perhaps that comes back to our spatial strategy not being quite correct in terms of where those sites are allocated. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Mr. Delaney next, please.
Thank you. A couple of points for me on this one. From a Captiva Homes perspective, I think we actually face a slightly different challenge, that we're typically chasing and racing to actually commence sites at the moment, partly driven by the issues we touched on earlier with regards to the lack of large sites to bring through the system. So it's not really dealing with an issue we as an organisation face. My observation would be, though, that whilst I understand the behaviour that it's trying to capture and to deal with, if we look retrospectively at some of the sites that we have got, large sites with permission and proposed allocations, and we applied this policy, I think the point others have raised, several of these large sites would be caught by this policy, broadly the sort of use it or lose it concept. But I don't see a reduction in the delivery numbers that reflects losing sites from the plan. So if we're going to accept that this kind of policy is going to be used, we would have to accept that some of the numbers being put forward would be lost. And we don't seem to have, again, back to buffers, probably an additional sites. We're going to see sites caught up in this that potentially are lost from the delivery plan, but aren't being mitigated for and dealt with.
Thank you, Mr. Long. Next, please.
Yeah, I mean, just echoing, when I first saw G5, I just thought it was a fairly blunt instrument against the problem that has arisen, and just from my own client base, even disregarding Captiva homes and fallen homes, they're the doers and they're making up the bulk of the supply in terms of even the imminent housing supply, to place that obligation when it's those companies that are chomping at the bit, and kind of planning system can't keep pace with the requirements of the develop. It just feels like a really sledgehammer to crack a nut approach, particularly when Justin said, and as mirrored in section 6.3, we're not unique. And I've never seen a policy like this in other local plan. It's just creating an extra burden, and echoing the point about investment on the Isle of Wight. These are things that kind of even your nationals will look at to go, gosh, that just, where is my investment? Yesterday I touched on the point, both raised about some of the old dated permissions starting with or applications in 18 as a consequence of whatever reason, but they're quite crusty and old, and made the point, that even from an ecological perspective, because of delays of something, the planning system can never catch up, as a consequence not borne by the applicant. And how do we feature that into this policy? It becomes quite a murky area, and I'm not sure you get the results that you necessarily want in terms of the outputs. I mean, just for one example, and is allocation HA 037, the council's library site. That this site's been around when I certainly had less grey hair and a slimmer profile. This is probably one of the older sites I know of that hasn't been touched. Yes, only 25 houses, but just to prove a point, the council then going to apply the same impositions upon themselves as a use it or lose it style policy on one of the strategic slimline strategic allocations. Needs to be careful with the approach taken. Not sure if it's whether the theme of the monitoring data wouldn't be best placed in a narrative of a wider strategic policy, rather than saying we're going to get the sledgehammer and really make life difficult for reasons and the unintended consequences arising.
Thank you. Mr. Pink, next.
Really just I love that analogy there, Dave, that the council will actually be probably caught by this on most of their sites, because they've all been around for many years and they're not delivering. I really do get the purpose of why this has been put in, and use it or lose it. We need certainty in the plan we get. But to me, you've got to have more of a laissez-faire approach to this. The development community will develop on a commercial basis. They will develop if there's a demand there. They will develop to fundamentally make profit. And sometimes there are obstructions in the way there. My concern is more for the SME side developer. The restriction this may give to a financer giving development finance or something like that. This really could be an element where suddenly we will not give you finance because there is this clause in your planning, for instance, that we could take it away from you, or we could stop this. And the world to get finance and development is very, very hard for a new developer. And that marketplace is so difficult to. We should be incentivizing this to grow, this marketplace. This will hold a part of the solution, certainly for the island, and putting these extra layers of red tape, I think causes the industry a lot of issues, really. And I really think that we should be. I get it, but I think the actual impact of it will cause an awful lot of issues, really. And to me, I think that comes back down to carrying firm, you have a wider sort of, you have that bigger buffer, then you've got to have this policy, it's a luxury. And to have that luxury, you need to have a lot more allocation, because then you can pull A sides, you can put that back. And it's a luxury at the moment, this plan does not project.
Thank you. Ms. Goodyear, your plate's still up.
Sorry, I was just reading the policy again and had a further point and perhaps a question for council too, is it says impose a planning condition or legal agreement to ensure the delivery timetable is stuck to. Just like, how is that going to be enforceable?
Part B of the policy. Okay. If I can come back to the council then, please. I mean, there's a few around the room, I think echoed in some of the reps in terms of describing as kind of unintended consequences of this policy, whether it would kind of come back to kind of bite the projected supply and the trajectory that we've been discussing this morning. I think probably some from the representations, the alternative would be not to have this policy within the plan. From the council's perspective, be interested to hear the response to the potential risk that this policy could create. It's being sort of suggested by the development sector, and the harm that would arise were we to recommend or not be able to find this particular policy sound. If there wasn't this policy in the plan, presumably in that scenario, the council's still got some of the powers and provisions through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. People are sort of saying this is potentially a sledgehammer to crack a relatively small nut. I don't know if the council necessarily sees it in that way, or whether you think actually the issue is more significant. Want to see delivery on the island. It's essential that we have this policy. Mr. Bolter.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I mean, I can understand what is being said, but I think from the perspective of the LPA, unfortunately, we do have enough examples where we could almost set our watches every 2 point something years waiting for a renewal to come in just to keep the permission ticking over. That's not to say that that's directed necessarily to anyone in this room or any recent examples, but there is a reasonable history of this happening, and ultimately this is a plan for everyone across the island, not just one that necessarily feeds the development sector. Now, we know that we both need each other. This is a two-way relationship. The LPA are judged on housing delivery, although we don't especially deliver ourselves, and obviously there's only one point or place to get a consent under the current system. So we do absolutely recognise that there is a relationship here and we need each other, but that also, I think it's only fair to say that that needs to be a two-way street, and it needs to be equitable to all parties in this process. Ultimately, certainty we've talked a lot about, haven't we? And absolutely, that's certainty to investors, developers, that's also certainty to elected representatives, but it's also certainty to communities. So if the LPA consents in good faith, expecting delivery, and we've heard this morning a lot about the certainty and being assured over the certainty of delivery, a lot. So this isn't looking to control delivery, as was suggested earlier. This is about seeking the commitment to delivery from those responsible. And if we're assured of delivery through the trajectory and discussions this morning, then we don't see that it would necessarily mean that some sites would have to drop out. I think this is the opportunity to be absolutely clear, however, that this isn't a policy to be, the intention is certainly not to shut up shop. You had your one shot, this is it. It's very much written with the intention behind. If there are legitimate and real reasons why, despite best endeavours, delivery has not occurred within the expected timeframes, then absolutely come and talk to us, tell us the reasons, let us understand them, and then let us work with you to try and tackle those. But if they aren't legitimate delivery reasons, then we're not just going to simply seek to renew every 3 years. Thank you.
And does the council have anything further it wishes to say in terms of just the practicalities of this policy and the point that was raised about criterion B and imposing a conditional or legal agreement, just on the practical side of that and consequences if I hear what Mr. Bolter says about, reasonable endeavours, and there may well be genuine circumstances where it's just simply beyond the control of a developer to meet that previously submitted timetable, delays in supplies or whatever the issue is. What's the council going to do? Is there going to have to be some kind of leap of faith that the council is going to be kind of pragmatic? How's the council going to enforce criterion B?
I guess criterion B is in some ways a product of what policy is trying to do, and you probably wouldn't have the policy. You wouldn't have the policy without criterion B, because then how are you offering any kind of control, and you just ask for it as a submission document and have it as part of the package rather than actually controlling it. So I think they work together. I understand the point around practicalities and how potentially anything in a legal agreement or condition would then need to be revised, and there's a process then to go through for that, and accept the point about red tape and bureaucracy. But I think, again, as Mr. Bolter set out, that we're trying to include a package of measures that talk to the housing requirement in the plan, the trajectory, and we've had a lot of conversation this morning around the trajectory and honing in on a couple of really high numbers. So on one hand, there's a honing in on a high number saying, well, look, you can do 700 in that year. Why can't you do it in every other year? But if we've got no measure of controlling that through potentially delivery timetables, then there has to be an acceptance that those numbers could blend over the plan period. So I think it's in some ways the two things are interlinked. I take the point around kind of practicalities of how that can be implemented. But from our perspective, we see it as a key component of the policy if the policy was to remain.
So just to add, I think we would see it would effectively become a trigger, then further action by the council, so that if the timetable that was set out in either the planning condition or the legal agreement was not being adhered to, the first step would be to understand why that was. So, was there a external constraint, whether it was to do with utilities, whether it was to do with, as it were, unexpected legal title issues that, etc., had only just come to light. So it would be the first element would be, why has it not been possible to achieve the delivery? Assuming that there wasn't, as it were, a convincing explanation for that, it would then be a matter for the council to reflect on what action should the council take. Obviously, there is the option, which is relatively draconian and little used, but there is the option of the completion notice to effectively say either get on with it or forego the opportunity to deliver. There is also the opportunity for the council to think about its compulsory purchase powers. Clearly, that's again quite a harsh step, but if you've got a stalled site and the persons presently responsible for the control of that site seem to be unable to bring it forward, but if there are others in the marketplace who would, clearly the local planning authority can facilitate that. Obviously, you'll be familiar with the concept of effectively back-to-back deals between the compulsory purchase authority and a developer who will then bring forward the development. But it's as Mr. Brewer was saying, there's a two-way street. Yes, a lot is being expected of local authorities in terms of achieving housing delivery, but given that they have to act through others, they do need some, as it were, abilities to influence the development sector where it doesn't seem that there is a good reason why the development sector isn't achieving. And it does also tie in, I think, perhaps with a point that Mr. James made at a much earlier stage. Not everybody, and I say I'm not making this as a comment about anybody who's in the room, but not everybody who brings forward a proposal for development is at that point of time wanting to see bricks and mortar come out of the ground, because there can be a whole range of financial or valuation reasons why people can see it in their interests to achieve, as it were, a paper, as it were, enhancement of value, but without it necessarily being in their interests at that point of time to want to see, I say, bricks and mortar delivery coming out of the ground. So the local authority does need to have some means of influencing that, which is why we think that this is, as it were, a reasonable way of drawing that balance.
Thank you. But if there wasn't the policy in the plan, would the council still have similar provisions or backstops through the legislation that the policy set references?
So that is a fair point, but it goes back to, in a sense, should the plan set out the expectations so that everybody knows where it's coming from, as opposed to leaving those other regulatory levers and powers to be exercised. In a sense, we're trying to be upfront about it, and we think therefore that is a better way of being effective than just saying, oh, well, you've got those other powers and you might use them in appropriate cases.
And we'd have to take a view as to whether being upfront, some of the other submissions around the table is that could have the unintended consequence of deterring investment or deterring decisions, because people will read this policy and think, is there another, is this creating further risk or uncertainty about whether we would get that kind of positive consent, particularly if we've got previously perhaps for good reason or otherwise, a track record of having to seek repeat permissions on a particular site. I mean, I do come back to previous kind of points made around hopefully through plan making and street housing land assessment processes, etc. What's going into the pot of supply has some reasonable kind of certainty that it's going to happen within the plan period, and issues past can to some extent kind of filter out of the system, but there may be sites that the council wants to give the benefit of the doubt to and not knock out through the plan process and try and through other means for the development to come forward. I'm not sure. I mean, obviously I've heard the submissions again just a moment ago that the alternative to this approach would be to allow for greater supply, to give you that kind of flexibility and headroom rather than I'm not sure I go so far as use the word draconian, whether it's some of these measures may fall into that camp. This is kind of more of a kind of a stick approach rather than the carrot of we want delivery and we want supply over the plan period. Why not release more sites, more opportunities? Council's obviously thinks about these things in terms of putting policy G5 into the plan. Mr. Brewer.
Yeah, just one point from me. I think on that, and you mentioned the kind of, and we've spoken about it a lot today and last week around the buffer and where that buffer sits and the level of buffer and the level of allocation. And I think certainly from our perspective as a council, if the view is taken that buffer or that level of allocation was increased, and I think this policy becomes even more because otherwise we're adding stuff into a trajectory with potential some uncertainty. And so, and again, I think that I mentioned earlier, that fluidity within the housing trajectory has to be taken alongside this policy or the absence of this policy. Those two things are quite closely linked.
just for bringing other people, Mr. Long took us through a history lesson on was it the former library site? The council also raised through its evidence around the issue of kind of non-delivery on a number of the 2001, so the 1996 unitary development plan sites. Are any of those sites that have not been delivered from the unitary development plan carried forward or extend into this plan?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Thank you. If I can bring in others, I'm mindful we're sort of closing in on sort of a lunchtime break, but I'll start with Mr. Long, Mr. James, then Ms. Goodyear, please.
I mean, the discussion's just got my brain whirring about the unintended consequences. I'm just thinking about, the subject was raised within the policy about use of conditions and or legal agreements to regulate the timetable. I think Mr. Pink's point about raising finance, I'll leave it, but I can just imagine a whole whirlwind of problems arising from finance. The finance institutions, they're so beady-eyed on these things because they're underpinning their risk. I just think the unintended consequences of that will be something very significant. But just on the kind of conditionality point or the legal agreement, this is how I think it would probably work out. We have a condition that can't have a tailpiece. You go into hearings or inquiries, the inspectors present your list of agreed conditions. I do not want tailpieces, i.e. unless otherwise agreed in writing at the back end of the condition. We can't do that. So then if you're at the tail end of a planning consent and it needs renewal, applicants are going to then have to do a section 73 application to revise the timetable because it's not open-ended, which then going to lead to more significant delays just discussing the conditionality point of timetable. You then move on to legal agreement. Oh, sorry, just on the conditionality, you then need to grapple with how that measures against the 6 tests of use of condition and whether it fulfills the tests. Difficult one. Or you go on to legal agreement, grappling with whether that's then still compliant to make the development acceptable in its otherwise land use respects. Don't know, possibly. But what will happen, I can imagine, is then in order to manage this risk, people will implement the consent and maybe not advance with it to its timetable fruition, given that what that will then spur the local authority to do is then make the measures of timetabling and enforceability even more stringent because people will be making the material commencement rather than building through phasing. And all we're going to do is going to get into a worse and worse planning system with this in place. And it feels a really heavy hitting policy structure. And I can forward thinking where we're going to be ending up with very complicated legal agreements to overcome a problem that isn't necessarily needed to be solved in the first instance. I think we need to be really careful. The unintended consequences again.
Thank you. Mr. James, next please.
Thanks, sir. I think the flaw in policy G5 is that it anticipates that all of the reasons for delay in delivery are on the development or builder side. And there are actually a wide range of reasons. It could be the general economy, it could be the finance market, it could even be the council itself, could be the reason why the scheme hasn't progressed. And I think it is potentially open to abuse because this policy sets up the council as the arbiter of whether delays have been unreasonable or not. But it also gives the council the policy to acquire the site itself, which actually creates an incentive, a perverse incentive for an unethical authority in the hypothetical future, which might be less interested in a private developer completing the site than it is in acquiring the site for its own ends. And I'm not saying anybody in the room would fit that category, but a policy has to be robust and protect against that possibility in the future of creating that perverse incentive to sort of go slow on the council side of things in order to achieve some other strategic goal for the council itself. So I would like to see a policy that didn't create those kind of perverse incentives.
Thank you. I think it was Ms Goodyear next and then Mr Berine. Please.
Thank you. Sorry, I've still got a bee in my bonnet about bee, and I don't want to repeat everything everybody said, but I just think you're setting the plan up to fail. There's no wording for condition or a section 106 in front of us, but I'm like, what's going to happen? You start building a house, you don't complete it on time, it doesn't have planning permission anymore. It's just not practical. It's not going to meet the tests.
Thank you, Mr Berine.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of brief points. First, I think I agree with sort of all the comments that have been made. I think with regard to this policy, I can see it's a policy that's there if you were meeting that with 703. You know, you're really pushing out delivery and everything else, and you really want to drive that forward and take that into account. What they're doing is the council are within themselves within terms of what they're delivering. It's based on what they can supply. So I don't see necessarily the necessity with it in the scope of this plan in terms of what it's delivering. Maybe if it was looking to push it out and go beyond what has been delivered in the past, then I can see where the council are coming from with regard to the policy. Then also but there's a sort of issue in terms of it's on all major developments, so it's on all sites of 10 plus. That seems quite onerous in terms of some of those small sites, in terms of all those conditions that are required. And then finally, with regard to D, require evidence to demonstrate different housing products. There is already policies with regard to mix that the council to consider sound in terms of those sites that are coming forward. And if they meet those mix, why is there a need to demonstrate that mix is deliverable? Surely that's taken care of elsewhere within the plan. Obviously, if a different mix were to be proposed, but then again, you might be proposing a different mix because there's other mix, so you start getting convoluted and disconnect between different policies in the plan and what this is intended. So again, it's potentially that unintended consequences of how it's being worded and how it's being phrased within this policy. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Is there anything further the council wishes to come back on this point? Just on that final point there about all major developments, obviously, as Mr Barron says, it's all schemes of 10. Just think about council resource and what the council's seeking to achieve through this policy, and that's proportionate.
Yes, and it would be all 10. And again, I'll come back to my starting point. It was obviously the level of information provided obviously would be proportionate to the scale of development coming forward as well. And I think Mr. Berent set out probably the biggest change in plan making, without saying it, is the housing delivery test and the impact that housing delivery test has on plan makers. And this policy talks to some of that in some ways, because the council are marked, if you like, on the delivery of housing, even though we don't deliver any housing as an LPA. And I think in some ways that kind of perhaps neatly sums up where we are on this, the reason for this. The housing delivery test exists. There's no sign of it disappearing at any time in the future. And that has quite serious implications for plan making, as we already discussed last week. And obviously this is part of the jigsaw puzzle in trying to address that in the best way that we can.
So could I just add on a couple of the legal points that arose out of some of those remarks in terms of Mr. Long's concern about the condition would be seen as a tailpiece, or including a tailpiece if there was a degree of variation. I think that's not applicable to a condition which requires you to adhere to a timetable, because that whole case law around why you can't have tailpieces is to do with, as it were, a consultation deficit, in the sense that if somebody applies for planning permission for scheme X, and therefore that's the subject of all the consultation and so on and so forth, there should not be a backdoor route for a local authority to, in due course, approve something materially different to X. Well, that's to do with the physical form of the development. That doesn't relate to the time at which development happens. So a timetable for when development should happen even if that timetable allowed the local authority to vary that timetable, would have no bearing on the content of the development. The development would still be the same development. So that case law on tailpiece conditions being not acceptable wouldn't bite on this type of condition, because this type of condition is only regulating when the development happens, not what the development is. So that was that point. So we think that just isn't a concern. And then secondly, on Mr. James's concern about, as it were, ulterior motives. Firstly, you have to assume, I think, in looking at any development plan, that the local planning authority that is responsible for applying its policies acts reasonably, in a sense of lawfully, and clearly a local authority that was seeking to do things for an ulterior motive, that would be prima facie unlawful, judicially reviewable and unreasonable. So that wouldn't, in our view, be a realistic risk. But secondly, as so I'm sure you will know very well, every compulsory purchase has to satisfy the policy tests for compulsory purchase, one of which is there has to be a compelling case in the public interest in order for you to interfere with what are Article 1 First Protocol rights of persons interested in land. And there would be effectively no realistic scenario that you could construct where a developer who is genuinely intending to take forward a development has it taken out of their hands by a local authority simply because they want to take forward the development. That just would never satisfy the compelling case in the public interest test. Again, we would say that's not a realistic concern. So I think that's probably enough from me, but I say we think those legal points are not really proper grounds against the policy.
Thank you. Is it a further brief point, Mr. Long?
Just on the conditionality part, the focus of my attention, whether it has a tailpiece or not, is the G5.A says required delivery timetable to be provided as part of the planning application. It then goes to say impose a planning condition to be built essentially in accordance with that delivery timetable. So just forward projecting a condition in order to probably try and meet the 6 tests, it would basically say shall be built in accordance with the delivery timetable. It's a factual piece of static paper that's been submitted with the application. It would be a different situation where a condition was imposed to say, prior to development commencing, you shall submit a delivery timetable to be agreed with the local planning authority. That means that that delivery timetable could be then agreed, but then subsequently varied through condition compliance rather than section 73 or a really draconian process. So there are ways to do it, but if it was kind of imposed against the delivery timetable as per A, I do see it running into problems.
Thank you. I think what we'll do is obviously reflect on what we've heard and read in the submissions, what we've heard today. I think shamefully, I've got to also brush up some of the detail in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act in terms of its interrelationship with this this policy, and we'll, if we need to sort of go further on this or invite the council to kind of assist us further in terms of the necessity or justification for this policy, we'll set that out in our sort of post-hearings analysis. I'm going to move on very briefly before we take the lunchtime adjournment. Just one final thing for this morning, this first part of today's Matter 7 session. It was just around the final part of policy H1. I think this all again speaks to ensuring delivery. I mean, as we started from this morning, hopefully the starting point and an increasing focus of plan examinations is that a plan is found sound on the basis of having a 5-year deliverable supply. So hopefully the wheels don't come off too soon on that. I appreciate that has been an issue. We cast our minds back to plans from 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. Authorities unfortunately found themselves in that position. think we need to sort of steer away from that, but as a kind of belt and braces approach, the council's put at the, I call it the sort of final part of policy H1, what it would do in the event that, you know, it did find itself not in the position of having a demonstrable 5-year supply, and whether those criteria are justified. We're talking a window of time, given what you were saying a moment ago, Mr. At the start today, Mr. Brewer, about a new timetable for a new plan.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And I think this probably talks to that topic of certainty, which we've spoken about quite a lot. So we just feel that this is necessary to ensure that if we did unfortunately end up in that position where we didn't have a 5-year housing land supply, then again the development sector has some clarity on how the council would see that potentially being addressed. Obviously, in our hearing statement, in our response to 7.8, we do suggest a minor change to the policy wording of this, just to make it absolutely clear that we're talking here around additional housing sites that don't meet the spatial strategy of the plan. Because obviously, if it meets the spatial strategy of the plan, it's all good. So that's an important distinction to make, and we feel the criteria there are justified. Obviously, they talk around the yield of the proposal coming forward being relative to the demonstrated shortfall. I don't think that's uncommon. And again, some other issues there around location, sustainably located, design, and obviously policy compliance with other parts of the plan. So that we feel that provides some clarity and certainty on that particular topic, should it unfortunately arise in the future. Let's hope it doesn't.
Thank you. Are there any further or final submissions on that part of policy H1 before I adjourn? Mr. Pink?
Just very quickly, just the word may is very wide in ranging and very subjective.
Thank you. I think we've had similar discussions on other policies around this, but Mr. Barines?
Comment really is that this is set within the context of a plan that's not meeting need, and it's based on the fact that and it's not meeting need because they say the market can't deliver anymore. And I think it's that context within which this is being provided. Surely, if there's sites coming forward that can meet need, do more, then it shouldn't be need to be a 5-year land supply issue, because there's already not a 5-year land supply against the full requirement. So it's just that context within which this is set. You know, otherwise positive in terms of actually, you know, if there is a 5-year land supply, then isn't a 5-year land supply, then that's very helpful. But it is in that context that they're not meeting need by any stretch of the imagination. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. Okay, if there's nothing further, then can I thank everybody for their contributions on this point. I think most, if not all of you, are potentially here for this afternoon when we come on to the second part of matter 7, which is more the housing mix. We'll be looking at the affordable housing policy and other policies around housing, yeah, the mix of housing types, etc. We'll do back here, I think, 2 o'clock. I'm losing track. Is Mr. Brewer's today one of the days where we've got a time constraint, or are we reasonably okay today?
We are free as a bird today, so we can go on as long as we like.
Right, we'll be talking about affordable housing till about 8 o'clock tonight. No, we'll be back here at 2 o'clock. Generally trying to finish the days about 5 o'clock, but if I can see people back here in the room at 2 o'clock, thank you.